"Travis, there's someone here to see you," the stout security guard said as he entered his boss's office. The man was dressed in a black business suit and looked like a classic American film bodyguard. "Yeah, and who's that?" Travis Carter, a well-known businessman and philanthropist in the city, was just reviewing the reports of one of the charitable foundations under his control. The wealthy man took a moment to look up from his papers and glance quickly at the security guard towering in front of his desk. He answered immediately, giving Travis all the basic information about their unexpected guest. "A man's here about a vacancy. Despite his age, he's a sturdy-looking man, but he says he can do the job. He's very anxious to see you." Travis thought for a moment, and then a brief chuckle flickered at the corner of his lips. "You say he looks like a homeless man? Very interesting." Travis took his fountain pen in a familiar motion and immediately made some notes in his diary. "Well, invite him over. Let's see what kind of candidate he is." The sturdy guard nodded, and putting his hand to his earpiece, quickly communicated the owner's answer to his partner, who, being in the courtyard of the luxurious mansion, instantly reacted and let in a tall, gray-haired man whose frown was capable of making anyone shudder. Even the big men who turned their heads at the entrance to the territory entrusted to him, at the gate every half an hour. "You'll be escorted out," the guard said briefly to the sullen man, pointing his hand in the direction of a neatly dressed woman in her 40s. She, in turn, contemptuously pressed her overly provocative dark maroon lipstick to her lips. It was obvious that she did not like the guest immediately. Aloud, however, she only said in a somewhat dismissive tone, "Please follow me. Travis really doesn't like to be kept waiting." The gray-haired man only smirked and replied sarcastically, "Yeah, have no fear. Go ahead, I won't run away from you. I didn't come out of the zoo," the guest sarcastically remarked. The businessman's housekeeper did not know how to respond to such insolence and simply walked up the stairs, gesturing for the visitor to follow her. The mansion of the millionaire was located on a separate, well-protected territory. A beautiful, dense forest grew near the house, and there was even a small park for walking, which also belonged to Travis. From the window of the study, Travis had a wonderful view of the small river that ran past the rich man's property. On particularly sunny days, the surface of the water reflected a myriad of sparkling reflections, making it seem as if a magical, glowing stream lurked near the businessman's home. "Thank you," Maggie, Travis said as she brought a visitor to him. "Tell me, how are things going with the luncheon there? My wife asked me to remind you. The dishes should have as many fresh vegetables in them as possible this time." Of course, Travis, the housekeeper, lowered her eyes. Bridget already called. "I personally relayed to the cook all her wishes, including the mineral water." "Yes, that's a must," the landlord nodded. "We'll need to drink more mineral-rich liquids right now. By the way, has the spring water been delivered yet?" "It's all waiting in the kitchen," the woman confirmed. And only then did the businessman let her go. "Well, come in, have a seat," Travis said, turning his attention to his guest. "Would you be so kind as to introduce yourself?" Brian, the man, replied in a low voice and walked briskly to the chair the rich man offered, then lowered himself into it and folded his hands in his lap. He looked at Travis almost point blank, as if scanning him with his dark gray eyes, which made the businessman want to look away. The guard was right. This Brian looked as if he had lived on the streets for years. His tattered old jacket had been artisanally stitched up in some places and more than once. His jeans looked decent, but there was a huge hole on his left knee, and it was definitely not part of the designer's design. The skin on his arms and face was covered with a deep, dark tan, so it was impossible to tell exactly how old he was. On the one hand, the man in front of him was clearly not young. Travis would have given him about 55. But on the other hand, the physical shape of the visitor could definitely give a head start to any 30-year-old. Even through his worn dark green t-shirt, his chest muscle showed through. The rich man could tell the same from a glimpse of his legs, strong, without a hint of flabbiness or weakness. Travis himself had turned 54 this year, but he looked nowhere near as strong and lean as the man sitting in the guest chair. For a second, Travis felt a pang of envy. Who would have thought that a homeless man, and probably with no money at all, could look so much better than a millionaire with the means to do so? "So you're here about a job," Travis said, looking at the scowling applicant carefully. At the same time, the rich man noted that his candidate, for all the hardships of life on the street, had fairly clean and neatly trimmed fingernails. "Well, that's not bad," Travis thought to himself. Hygiene, after all, no one had canceled yet. "Yes, I saw your advert in the free paper. It said you needed a strong and reliable helper for your sick son, so I've come. I'm willing to work as your guide. Your son is blind, isn't he?" Travis looked at his guest with undisguised surprise, and then his lips curled into an ironic grin. "Brian, I don't know what your baddie name is, but are you sure you can handle this?" "You can just call me Brian," the candidate interrupted him abruptly. "Or you can call me by my surname, which is Brian Johnson's. That's what everyone I know calls me." Startled by this simplicity, bordering on tactlessness, Travis continued, choosing his words carefully. "Okay, Brian. Thank you for clearing that up for me right away. "The fact is, my son is not blind," the businessman continued. "Will suffered a severe poisoning not too long ago. The doctors barely saved him. Unfortunately, the toxins took a serious toll on his physical system, causing complications to spill over straight to the joints in the lad's legs." For the record, Travis raised his index finger. "My son is far from a kid anymore. He turned 23 that year. So my son needs a calm and easygoing person around him right now. Someone to help him with getting around outside and traveling to the clinic where Will is currently being treated." "Then why don't you hire staff from the hospital?" Brian wondered in turn. Travis noticed how Brian said this without rancor, with what seemed to the businessman to be genuine empathy for his son's condition. He's probably in pain all the time, poor guy. This Travis liked very much. "That's the problem. My son doesn't want the medics to look after him. He says, 'I'm not disabled. Why do I need carers and IVs in the house?' Will wants to feel independent. Except that the physical limitations he has to endure now are draining my son emotionally. If we add to that the people in white coats running back and forth through our house, I'm afraid he's going to lose heart, and the latter is incredibly important to us. Even his GP says that the more positive emotions the lad has, the sooner he'll be able to say goodbye to the pram and crutches for good." An awkward silence hung between the men for a moment. Then the businessman calmly said, "Think carefully, Brian. Can you be a worthy companion for my son? It's very important to me that you calculate your own strength here first, that you don't let Will down." Brian nodded confidently in response. "I can do that, Travis. I'll do whatever it takes to get your son back on his feet as quickly as possible. You can count on me." Travis took one last careful look at his guest and then, shrugging his shoulders, signed some form on his desk and said, "Well, let's see you in action then. Brian, you start tomorrow. You'll be staying directly in my house. I don't suppose you mind." "No, why should I mind?" Brian responded calmly. "I'm just glad I won't have to go out of town." Travis handed him the contract. "Great, then sign here and here." He pointed him to the blue tick boxes. "As of this moment, you officially become my son's assistant companion. Is that correct?" "Good, now let's go meet Will. It's his day off. He's in his room." As they approached the room of the heir to Travis' business empire, he pointed to the door next to his son's room. "You will live here, so that at any time, if you need anything, you can come in quietly from the next room instead of running here from the ground floor. I'll tell the maid to make arrangements for you." The man knocked gently on the handsome, light wood door. "Will, son, may I come in?" Well, Travis turned out to be a pleasant young man who, even while in bed, managed to simultaneously negotiate video calls with his father's partners and jot down key thoughts in his own workbook to formulate business strategy for the next quarter. Brian would never have imagined that this energetic guy was now forced to move around with only assistants or aides. On the right side of Travis Jr.'s wide bed was an expensive wheelchair with a remote control. The lad didn't use it much now, but there was a time when without it Will couldn't even make it to the small in-house lift at the end of the floor. "That's it, Jonathan. Can't talk anymore, sorry. Let's call again this afternoon. I'll give my father your thoughts on the new investment portfolio." Will smiled at someone in the monitor by the silver laptop before pressing the end button on the connection and closing the lid of the computer. "Will, have you been working again?" Dad said with a slight reproach in his voice. "The doctor told you clearly, as little strain as possible, intellectual strain included. Give your body a chance to recover properly already." Travis walked across the room to his son and gently took the laptop from his hands. "Dad, I'm begging you," Will exclaimed. "I'll be so bored I'll die of boredom if I also stop participating in the affairs of our company. How will Jonathan be able to pick the right stocks without me? He has absolutely no sense of analytics and long-term economic forecasts." However, the businessman was adamant and did not intend to leave his son any working inventory. "I don't know anything, son. You need to rest before lunch." It was only at that moment that the rich man remembered that his new employee was still standing in the doorway of his son's room. "Oh, Will, I'm sorry. I'm so out of touch with reality with this job." The businessman jokingly tapped his fist on his forehead and then gestured for Brian to come closer. The man calmly walked over to the young heir's bed and held out his hand to the lad. "Brian Johnson's, your new companion and assistant," the gray-haired man said calmly and with dignity. Will was somewhat confused, but responded to the offered handshake and then looked questioningly at his father. "Is that what I think it is, Dad? Is this man going to accompany me to the clinic in rehab?" Brian at this point noticed the unnaturally pale appearance of the boy. Apparently Travis had been right when he said that the doctors had had to work hard to get his son out of the other side on the innard. "That's right. Brian will help you when you need it. I've had a room prepared for him next door to yours." Travis hesitated for a moment and then glanced at his watch and spoke quickly. "Well, I guess we can leave you two alone so you can get to know each other properly. If anything, I'm in my office. I've got a few more reports to check on, and I'm running out of time. I'll see you in the dining room." "Of course," Father Will nodded. "Don't worry. I think we can find some common ground with Brian." When he and Brian were alone together, the rich man's son immediately set the stage. "You don't think It's not forever. The doctor said I won't be disabled, except that the toxins must be completely eliminated from the body and all the constituent fluids. Then I'll be able to walk again like I used to. I didn't doubt that, Brian remarked calmly and looked around Will's room. Oddly enough, the young businessman's bedroom didn't contain a large amount of any fancy gizmos or a huge wardrobe of hundreds of business suits and a display case of diamond cufflinks. If the young man's assistant had not known who was now sitting in front of him, he would have thought that Shumilan Jr. was a very ordinary bloke. From the whole interior of the room stood out only a rack with equipment, a record player, a small chest of drawers with a collection of vinyl discs, a beautiful electric guitar hung on a leather belt, on a special metal device built right into the wall. "You into music?" Brian remarked, after which he cautiously approached the guitar. The instrument was beautifully made. Brian himself had a knack for it. "Yeah, there's a bit of it," Will replied simply. "Used to play something like that all the time when I had more free time. I remember even making up some tunes. After my dad got me involved in his business, I didn't have much to do." Brian turned to the boy. "What about sports? Exercise machines, running?" Will, instead of answering, pointed at his sore legs with an eloquent smile. "No way. It's hard to walk to the toilet on my own. It's not like running, although I do work out on special simulators in the rehabilitation center. It's like learning to walk again. And sometimes I get on the treadmill under the supervision of a physiotherapist. But I've only been able to crawl like a snail so far, but I think there's more to come." Will and Brian laughed amicably. Brian liked the fact that Carter Jr. had such an easygoing nature. To be honest, he'd expected to see some fastidious major with bouts of depression and hysterical outbursts. Will turned out to be quite different, and this gave the man hope that it would be easy to work with him. The businessman's son said that since childhood he had lived a very ordinary life, except that his family had much more money than the parents of other classmates. "My father and mother worked hard all their youth, just to get back on their feet. Dad wasn't always such a famous businessman. He started out in a very small business. He and his friends sold radio parts. Then, when they got their start, he decided to move up a level and started to develop design technologies, which he offered to potential buyers, owners of large TV and radio communication networks. He was lucky he was noticed, and so it went from there." Will tried to lower his feet to the floor on his own, but then a grimace of pain contorted his face. "You wait. Take your time." Brian immediately came to his aid. "Let's go down one at a time, little by little. That's it. Make sure you don't bend your knee too far at right angles. It'll hurt less." "How do you know?" "You're a resuscitator." The boy looked at him in surprise. "Rather, I've been through knee trouble myself, so I understand well what you're feeling right now, and I know how to master your legs in your situation to reduce the pain effect. You don't always have to rely on pills, do you?" The boy brushed a strand of blonde hair out of his face and exhaled in relief when his feet finally touched the ground. "Right," Will confirmed with a heavy sigh. "I can't even look at these vials and IVs anymore. To be honest," the boy admitted. "But the doctors say I can't do without them." When the man and the young man went out into the corridor, Brian helped the boy to keep his balance, and Will leaned confidently on his crutches. The young man finished his story about his family. "My mom is a wonderful person. She's been a social worker all her life. Now that she has such an opportunity, she herself participates in creating funds, collecting money for sick people and those from difficult life situations. You could say she's a top-class volunteer." The boy smiled, and Brian noted to himself how much he obviously loved his mother, talking about her with such warmth. A very rare phenomenon for today's golden youth. "That's the reason I showed up at their place rather late," the lad continued. "They were already in their 30s when I was born. Then it was business as usual. School, university. True, I studied in England, but that's how my father wanted it. He said it was the best education in economics." "You don't sound very happy about that education, do you?" Brian remarked, pressing the red lit lift button. "Well, what's there to be excited about?" Will shrugged. "I mean, I realized I needed this education like air. My father said he'd put me in charge of the company in less than 10 years. It's easy to imagine what a fool I'd be to take the reins while being completely clueless about my future work." The lift door opened softly and the man and the young man stepped inside. At that moment, a text message arrived on Will's phone. With a quick glance at the sender's name, the guy smiled and shoved his mobile phone deeper into the pocket of his jeans. "I see you have a girlfriend too," his companion asked slyly with a squint. "I hope she's as savvy as you are." "That's Jennifer," the boy answered him briefly. "You just don't talk about her in front of your father or he'll start shouting again." Brian gave his ward a questioning look, but refrained from asking further. It was none of his business, after all, and he wasn't interested in what was outside of Brian's purview. A little later at dinner, however, Brian understood the reason for the younger man's reaction, for although he was in the servants' kitchen next door to the dining room, he could clearly hear the voices of discontent. Travis' own voice. "Will, son, Rachel complained to me about you again today," the businessman was saying indignantly. "She said you don't pick up the phone when she calls you and you delete her messages right away." So what's the big deal, father? We've discussed this 1,000 times, his son answered him coldly. I don't like her, and I'm not going to resume any kind of relationship with her. And before this whole affair, I didn't want to marry her, and now I will not change my mind about it. I mean, what kind of wedding are we talking about? If I can walk, I can barely walk. Any retired grandfather could outrun me in 5 minutes. Travis gave his stubborn offspring a stern look. You're wrong, Will. Oh, you're wrong. You see, this isn't some girl off the street. You can't just reject her. This is the daughter of some of our oldest friends and one of our most trusted business partners. You know how Uncle Harry used to ride you around on his neck when you were a kid? How many birthday presents did he give you and Rachel? The ones with a hint, remember. Harry is a man of utmost integrity and foresight. You weren't even 4 when we agreed to join families and businesses. It's a perfect match for you. She's not your bride, is she, son? She's an Oxford graduate. For one thing, Oxford. Travis meaningfully shook his fork with a piece of perfectly baked trout on it. Will stared sadly at the fish, then said sadly, That's the thing, Dad. You and Mom have always decided everything for me. What I'm going to be when I grow up, who I'm going to be friends with. And now you're taking over my personal life. Will, honey Bridget, tried to reason with her son. What's wrong with that if we've been looking at the most suitable girl for you for a long time? If you try to look at a lot of things a little more broadly, his mother finally found the right word. You'd realize that Dad and I, on the contrary, have always tried to keep you safe from possible mistakes. How so? The lad grinned bitterly. I basically never in my life even had the opportunity to make those mistakes. Do you know what I really love, Mom? Music, and the girl I want to marry loves it too. You say we should take a broader view of things, but if that were true, you'd have realized long ago that I only started studying economics because the situation with my father's company demanded it. If I really had any choice in life, I would have chosen to become a famous music producer or write music myself at all. Oh, Will, you're breaking my heart, Bridget exclaimed and clutched her chest demonstratively. Well, look at you, boy. What are you driving your mother to? Travis said sternly and poured his favorite spouse a glass of water. And if by a girl who also likes music you mean you're Jennifer, you don't even have to go on. I don't expect me to let you two get married. Dad, why? The son looked at him incomprehensibly. Because you know how she feels about me, don't you? It is a sincere and genuine feeling. She is ready to help me and support me always, whether I can walk now or not. And this one of yours, if you insist on her so much, hasn't even visited me in the hospital since the poisoning. She calls every time for the sole purpose of finding out if I've walked on my own 2 feet. I guess she's afraid she'll be forced to marry a defective man, Will said, picking up his crutches and slowly made his way to the lift. Son, we're not done having this conversation yet, the businessman warned him. The young man turned to his family. Mom, Dad, I love you very much, I really do. But I no longer intend to let you interfere in my life and make me into whatever you want me to be. I want to be me, you know. Me, thank you for lunch. It was delicious. I think I'll rest in my room for a while. I'm tired. And the boy slowly made his way out of the dining room. Brian, sitting in the small kitchen for the household staff, only sighed heavily. Never mind, Thomas, the local gardener pronounced. They fight about it all the time. No need for any television. See what kind of passions they have going on over there. It's like us ordinary people. Jennifer is Will's girlfriend, right? Brian clarified. Well, yeah, Thomas confirmed, putting a piece of corn tortilla in his mouth. But I just don't know if it'll work out with her or not. I mean, she's no match for our prince. Why is that? Brian furrowed his thick silver eyebrows. So she's from the poor, explained the gardener, not a rich girl at all. Her father works as a janitor somewhere in town. Her mother works in a factory. From morning till night, how they make ends meet, even I can't imagine. But she and Will must have crossed paths somewhere. I see, replied the companion thoughtfully, and put his plate in the sink. Brian, are you finished? Came suddenly from behind Brian, a thin, unpleasant voice. Turning round, the man saw Maggie, the housekeeper. The woman was looking at the new employee of their home with contempt. In her hand, she held some sort of bundle. Yes, do you need any help? Brian asked her. No, thank you very much, she gritted through her teeth and tossed Brian a small cloth bundle containing clean. These are for you, the housekeeper said reluctantly. Travis instructed you to dress in anything fresh. After all, you're living in decent society now, not on the streets. Please change your clothes now. But if the master himself requests it, then it's a different matter, the guide replied calmly. You should calm down a little, my dear. You're walking around all worked up like you're about to explode, just in case someone gets hurt. You know what they say about ladies with a temper like that. Maggie blushed, then whispered angrily. How dare you, rude. With that, she turned sharply on her heels and walked out of the kitchen. The last thing Brian heard before he went to his room was Thomas laughing softly. From that moment on, Maggie began to keep glancing askew in Brian's direction. Not a day passed without the strange woman pointing out some misstep to Will's assistant or noting his bad behavior. Brian tried to keep his dignity and silence on such occasions, or to make an unkind joke that would put the housekeeper in her place. After all, although he was a mostly taciturn man, he was not going to tolerate being bullied. One day, walking past his immediate superior's office, Brian overheard Maggie complaining to Travis. "Have mercy, Mr. Travis, but this is getting impossible. You ought to take a closer look at Brian. He's got the eyes of a maniac or a thief. He's always on the prowl, always on the prowl. It's none of my business, of course. But if I were Bridget, or if I were Will, I wouldn't be in such a hurry to trust this man so blindly. After all, it's not for nothing that they say a stray dog is only affectionate when he's fed, and when he doesn't like something, he'll pounce on a trusting owner." "Maggie, calm down. What are you so nervous about?" The businessman calmly contradicted her, after which he smiled slyly. Could it be that Thomas was telling the truth yesterday? Can you imagine? He seriously believes that you, and how can I put this delicately, show sympathy for my son's guide in such an unorthodox way? The housekeeper's face twisted instantly, as if her master had just told her she'd eaten a cockroach. "Travis, but you're a well-mannered, cultured man. Why do you listen to the ramblings of some gardener? It's his job to look after the plants and the flowers. But I'm going to tell him that on his own. The truth is, Travis, you should kick your guide out. Look at him. He's already quarreled half the staff with his actions." Travis rolled his eyes theatrically to the ceiling. He was getting tired of his housekeeper's endless complaints. "Maggie, I assure you so far the only person in the house who has a completely dysfunctional relationship with Brian is yourself. And please stop catching me on my legitimate break. Just because I ask you to bring me coffee doesn't mean I'm eager to discuss all the gossip about my employees with you." But Travis, the housekeeper tried to say something else. The millionaire, however, interrupted her sharply. "That's enough. You are a woman, after all. Is it so difficult for you to find an approach to a man? Yes, Brian is a peculiar man, not very sociable, but you should try." Maggie flushed with anger, but said only discreetly, "As you wish, Mr. Travis, I understand." Whereupon she left her master's office with a quick step. Brian, who was an unwitting witness to this conversation, had barely had time to take refuge in the caretaker's closet before the housekeeper noticed the guide. Meanwhile, Brian himself continued to support Will in everything. He traveled with him to hospitals, helped with training at the rehabilitation center, and generally behaved like a kind older friend. The wise, judicious man became almost a friend to the young man, despite the fact that he was old enough to be his father. Sometimes Will was surprised at how strong his assistant Brian was for his already mature years. Brian, however, only grinned in response. "That's why I don't tell anyone my middle name. I don't want people to think of me as an old man. I still feel young myself, and you can always train your body, no matter how old you are." Brian almost never said anything about his past life. All that was known to his ward was that Brian had lived on the streets for a very long time, and the man had to literally survive. This often manifested itself in his habit of gathering and storing food in his room, for which he was regularly chastised by Ellie, a young maid whose passion for cleanliness and order suggested that she had some psychological problems. Otherwise, the guy didn't understand how to explain her unbridled energy in cleaning, scrubbing, and ridding every piece of furniture of those ubiquitous dust particles. "Brian, you're doing it again," she threatened him with a fluffy broom. "How many times have I told you not to take fruit and biscuits out of the kitchen? There's crumbs all over the place. And who hides bread under the pillow? You don't live in a detention center, do you? If you want a snack, our communal fridge is always open. Within reason, of course." Brian didn't take offense at the pretty maid's words. He merely shrugged his shoulders and replied briefly, "I'm sorry, sweetheart. It's my nature. Tramps are always ready to stuff more into their pockets. I didn't do it on purpose." "I get it." Ellie nodded good-naturedly and swept the rest of the rubbish into a small bucket. "Just please try to tame that nature sometime in the future. Okay? I've got 2 more floors to clean. I'd like to be free by tonight." Brian assured her that he'd try not to hide any more breadcrumbs and biscuits in his room, and then he'd go to Will's room to see how he was doing, or just to talk. They talked often now. Brian appreciated the young man's ability not to talk too much among his friends and family, and so at some point he was able to confide in him and tell him a little more about his life. "You're basically my last chance," Will Brian told him once in a burst of frankness. "I didn't think before I met you that I could ever live in human conditions again. It was that bad." "Really?" Looking at his guide, the boy asked him. Yeah, Brian stretched out, kind of shut himself off from the world around him. At this point, he really did look his real age. "Once upon a time, a long time ago, I was normal too," the guide told him. "Thought I'd have a family, kids." The man sighed heavily, and then everything went wrong in an instant. "My wife Helen crashed on the production line. That's where it all started, you might say." Brian rubbed his palms together nervously, as if he was suddenly very cold. "I started drinking a lot. I'd get so drunk I couldn't remember how I got across town, and there was no point in coming home. The flat was empty and lonely without Helen anyway. At that moment, the black realtors came out on me and said, 'Why do you need such a big flat, man?' So I fell for it. Now I realized that they were giving me something to drink. Otherwise, I would never have signed those damned papers." Did you end up on the street after that? Will asked him sympathetically. Well, yeah, Brian replied. So I started drinking and loitering. Once in a while I got a job as a loader at the railway station. They paid better there, and you could do something useful all night long without drinking. And you keep asking me where I got my figure from. The man grinned. But if you carry sacks of coal and cement, you'll be a Schwarzenegger. But I was just trying to survive, and not to starve to death if possible. The boy patted his guide's hand with genuine concern. Brian could see the genuine pain in his eyes. Will had been a deeply sensitive person since childhood. His mother had passed that trait on to him. Now, being the possessor of compassion and a sensitive nature, the lad seemed to want to take away all the bad things that had happened to his wonderful assistant. Brian, you know I've never judged you and I never will. We each have our own backpack of secrets behind our shoulders. It's really hard for me to realize right now that this is happening in our lives. Do you know how many times I've put myself in the shoes of these poor kids whose parents have to raise money for their treatment? My dad sponsors several charities. And when I was a kid, he took me there many times. I kept seeing their eyes and the eyes of their loved ones, the utter despair of hopelessness and hope. Hope that this could be over if they could just raise the money they needed. It was the same with my mom. She used to take me to homeless shelters, and I've seen the despair with which they look at all the people who are more fortunate in life than they are. Thanks for understanding, Brian nodded. Maybe that's why you grew up to be such a normal guy, because despite your wealth, you've also seen the downside of society and human life in general. Will shook his head negatively. Don't you get it, Brian? When I saw all those people, I only asked myself one question. What's that? Will asked after a few seconds of silence. You wouldn't believe it, sadness flashed across the young man's face. I've been asking myself why I've been lucky in this life, and they haven't. What does it have to do with? Why I can have everything I need to live a good and comfortable existence, and they don't even have the opportunity to spend the next night under a roof. Brian looked at the boy warmly. Don't torture yourself. No one knows the answers to these questions. You're only eating yourself up inside with these thoughts, and they're of no use. You're already happy when you realize there's a whole other life outside your palace. Your mother and father control you too much, but they're good. Good because they help people like us, not with words, but with deeds. That alone, believe me, Will, is worth a lot. On an impulsive impulse, the young son of the businessman hugged his guide tightly. At that moment, it seemed to the boy that he had met a truly kindred spirit, a like-minded person who understood perfectly well what kind of passion and all kinds of philosophical thoughts were raging in the head of the still very young Will. 3 weeks later, Brian stood in front of Travis in his office and argued to him the need for a guard dog. Brian, I'm certainly willing to assist you in anything that concerns my son's health, but have mercy. Why do we need a dog? The businessman sincerely did not understand his employee. Terrence and Nathan are doing an excellent job. It's not for nothing that they had special training at the military base. The base is a base, of course, Brian agreed, but there's only 2 of them on the whole estate. Besides, you've got a forest nearby. There's no telling who might come from there, and the dog could be trained to warn your boys in advance which way to run. And in general, in a house like yours, without a good dog is simply impossible. I've already got a good dog in mind. A friend of mine called from the kennel recently, offering to take him for nothing. Travis scratched at the back of his head with a biro. Well, if you think it's really that vital to us, then. The rich man spread his hands. Only I warn you at once, the dog is your responsibility. If anything goes wrong with him, you'll be the first to be asked. I don't worry about that, the guide assured him. For my part, when I told Will about the dog, he was very much in favor. It will do him good to have a dog to work with, too, won't it? He'll get better faster. He's doing so well, he's even started to move around without crutches, only very carefully and within the confines of his room. But I think he's getting better. Travis even crossed himself 3 times. Thank God my prayers have been answered. I should tell my wife before she goes off on business again. Thank you, Brian, for being so protective of my son. If it weren't for you, I don't know if he would have recovered in such record time. The next day, Brian brought the new lodger into the house and ceremoniously introduced him to all the residents. Will indeed turned out to be absolutely delighted with the dog. The German shepherd named Taylor immediately recognized the boy as his new master, along with the showman and Brian the smart, cheerful dog barked happily as he ran around the yard, then ran up to the male owners of the house and licked their hands with pleasure or stood on his hind legs to kiss Travis on the nose. Wow, big beastie, swaying under the weight of the dog, the businessman said. Brian, how old is he anyway? 2 years, replied the guide with a smile. He's still young. He'll serve faithfully for a long time. Maggie was the only one to whom the arrival of a dog in the house brought absolutely no joy. Another filthy monster, she said to the gardener, wrinkling her nose at the door to the pantry. Only this time it's a shaggy one, too. You shouldn't say that about him, Maggie Thomas muttered reproachfully. The man's trying to do what he wants to do best, and Will's feeling noticeably better under him. You'll see. That guide of yours will bring us more trouble, the woman said irritably. then disappeared into the bowels of the pantry. A week later, the entire Travis family was invited to Harry's anniversary party, the same one whose daughter his parents had urged Will to marry. Since the party was going to last until the morning, the rich people had decided to give almost all the employees of their house a day off. The gardener and the maid went home to see their families and spend the day in a domestic atmosphere. Brian, Taylor, and housekeeper Maggie, and 2 guards remained at Travis Manor. Late in the evening, when no one else was in the house, the worst happened. 3 Muggle burglars had somehow broken into the grounds of the mansion and slowly made their way into the house, taking advantage of the basement, where there was an underground garage and access to a lift that led straight into the lobby of the house. Brian was resting in the garden at the time, just in time to hear a strange rustle on the east side of the hedge. He quietly called to the sheepdog, who was just settling down for the night in his new kennel. Brian cautiously followed all 3 of them. Judging by their clothes and movements, they were clearly pros at work in this case. Dark clothes, running eyes, and masks made the villains almost indistinguishable in the darkness of the blue evening. Bounty bags protruded from their shoulders, and knives with perfectly sharpened blades gleamed in their hands. "What's the deal?" "I don't get it," Brian whispered. "Where are Terrence and Nathan?" Creeping along the wall, Brian quickly found the answer to his question. The 2 guards were lying side by side. They were unconscious. Checking the men's pulses, the guide made sure they were alive. Brian silently followed the robbers. The clever dog walked silently beside them. Taking the lift to the ground floor, Brian and Taylor cheerfully greeted the robbers. "Guys, good evening. Why are you working here without lights? You won't be able to carry the most important stuff away." All 3 of them slowly turned in his direction. "Ah, so it's that old clown. Get him out of here, brothers. We don't want to leave any witnesses." 2 tall, powerful men drew knives from their belts and lunged at the guide and his dog. But Brian was not as simple as he wanted to appear. With a few confident, painful grapples and crushing kicks to the jaw and groin, Brian was able to knock the weapons out of their hands. Taylor hooked the 3rd creep in the leg, whereupon a bright light flashed in the room. "Jesus, what's going on here?" screamed a night-dressed Maggie. Brian, however, had time to notice the unconcealed anger and frustration flashing in the housekeeper's eyes. "Get out of here, you bald-headed sheep, before we kill you," the leader yelled, and then thrust his knife straight at Brian, throwing the dog away from him at the same time. The unbearably white light of the lamp blinded Brian for only a fraction of a second, but that, alas, was enough. The knife drew a straight line in the air and plunged into the brave guide's chest. Gasping with pain and the taste of blood in his mouth, Brian slowly sank to the floor. Maggie shrieked and threw her hands up to her twisted, chalk-white face as police sirens sounded in the front yard. Turns out it was concerned neighbors. Travis, who, hearing the screams and menacing barking of a dog in the middle of the night, had called the police, and at the same time, an ambulance. The special squad, which arrived with the police, instantly twisted all 3 of them. The paramedics rushed first to Brian, who was on the verge of life and death. He was quickly placed on a stretcher, as were the 2 guards. Terrence and Nathan had fallen victim to a powerful dose of sleeping pills that could have been fatal to the men had they not taken the appropriate steps to detoxify their bodies. "Actually, what's going on here in my absence?" Travis, who was driving to his mansion at the same time, asked in amazement. The neighbors thought to call the owner of the estate. He, having learnt that his house had been attacked, immediately left the Jubilee and arrived at the scene of dramatic events, leaving his wife and son at the party. The businessman wanted to personally look into the reasons for what happened. "What are you doing? Where are you taking him?" Rich asked 2 doctors who were just loading a stretcher with the injured Brian into an ambulance. "He's got a severe stab wound. It's counting down to minutes." One of the medics pushed the businessman's hand away. "We're not sure we can save him. There's too much blood loss." "Get him to City 2, Travis pressed the doctors. "Don't worry about the rest. I have my own people there. Do everything you can just to make sure this man survives. He risked his life trying to protect my property." The medic only nodded briefly, and the ambulance door slammed shut in front of the businessman's nose with a loud thud. Travis quickly dialed the number of a surgeon he knew from the same clinic. Having agreed with him about the operation, the millionaire did not hesitate a minute, got into his car and followed the ambulance. When the businessman arrived at the clinic, the first thing he did was to rush to the gurney on which the unfortunate guide was being taken to the operating theater. Travis whispered with bloodless lips, "Brian, it's all Maggie. Look closely at her eyes. Malice in them, only malice." Brian Johnson's fainted, and the uncomprehending millionaire was horrified to see the gray wig suddenly slip from the guide's head. Beneath it was short-cropped, dark blonde hair. Some unfamiliar young man approached Travis and then showed him his police ID, Captain Nicholas Morris. "I think you and I have a lot to talk about." "Sure," Travis stammered as he continued to stare at Brian's wig in bewilderment. Morris took him to a spare room where he sat him down on an empty bed. "Calm down, Travis. Brian Johnson's is our employee. It would be more correct to say Lieutenant Colonel Brian Johnson's." "What?" The businessman couldn't believe his ears. "You mean my son's guide is a policeman? What kind of nonsense is that?" It's not nonsense, the captain answered him calmly. Brian has been undercover for a long time. It's his professional speciality, if you will. Morris smiled proudly. He's been a lot of things during his tenure, homeless theater worker. He even played a hitman once. But in your case, he needed to infiltrate the estate with a realistic cover story. But why? Travis puzzled. For the sake of you and your son. Brian was to work a gang of robbers who had been making such daring raids on the homes of well-to-do citizens for a very long time. They drugged your guards with powerful sleeping pills. As for Will, do you remember the circumstances under which he was poisoned? The businessman remembered in minute detail the details of that ill-fated day. Well, it had been very hot, of course. It was July after all. I think it was some bad juice. Maggie threw the whole bag away so that, God forbid, no one else would get hurt. But we were scared out of our minds. The doctors had to drain my son for hours on end. Morris grinned meaningfully. She originally suggested all the family members, didn't she? What are you implying? The rich man did not immediately realize. But later it came to him. You think Maggie might have known the juice was poisoned. And not only did she know, but she put the poison in it herself, said the policeman. Cut off, Maggie Adams is a career criminal, a member of the very same gang. A former nurse, she's very good at concocting deadly cocktails of all sorts of drugs. So it's almost impossible to prove a person died or suffered from unnatural causes. She brought your boys poisoned tea. She gave them such a dose that they nearly died. A little more and they wouldn't have been saved. So my housekeeper, is she a murderer? I'm afraid so, the captain nodded to him. We've had a few cases like this before, except it ended much more sadly, with no surviving family members. Your son apparently had a few drinks, and the doctors went to great lengths to save him. So Will is a lucky man. You are incredibly lucky that Brian was also in the house with you this time. Yes, we were all at the anniversary, Travis responded sullenly. On the contrary, I blame myself for not figuring out that Maggie Adams in time. And after all, she kept complaining to me about Brian, how she felt that his appearance in the house might foil her devious plans. I'll tell you right off, she was plotting a special revenge. Not for nothing did the housekeeper send her knife-wielding thugs at Brian. She gave her accomplices the access codes to the gates leading to the underground car park. That way they could get into the house. But when a fight broke out, all the housekeeper had to do was play a comedy act in front of the SecFA cameras to create an ironclad alibi. But it didn't go according to plan. God, what a horror. Travis clasped his hands over his face. You don't get so upset, the policeman patted him on the shoulder. After all, remember, it could have ended much worse. At that moment, the men noticed outside the door of the room where they were sitting, as doctors hurried in and out of the intensive care unit. There at this time, the best surgeons were just fighting for Brian's life. Nothing is going to work unless we give him a blood transfusion, the surgeon operating on the cop's partner declared after a while, except that his group and phenotype are very rare, type 4, Roche negative. Where are we going to find one of those? And now, the millionaire's face brightened. You will, doctor. I have that very blood type and ray factor. The surgeon turned to the businessman in surprise. Are you sure? With a doubtful glance at Travis, the doctor interjected. Absolutely, the man nodded. Let's get this done as quickly as possible. I want the man who saved my family to survive. During the transfusion, the surgeon secretly did a comparative DNA test of their blood in secret from both men. It was all too rare in his medical career to have such amazing coincidences. When everything was ready, the surgeon couldn't believe his eyes. My God, but that's impossible. God works in mysterious ways, he muttered. When Brian was feeling much better, the doctor approached Travis and showed him the results of the examination. 99.9% probability of parentage, the businessman said with one lip, and then turned to the doctor. There can be no mistake. No, the man shook his head. If science says you and Lieutenant Colonel Bran are siblings, then that's what it is. Travis squeezed the test silently. Tears ran down his cheeks. Bringing his son into the room with the recovering policeman, the man gathered his wits before showing the papers to Brian and Will. But how is that possible? Brian marveled. I've always been the only child in the family for as long as I can remember, though the policeman's face turned pale. Jesus, and then businessman Travis began his story. I always knew that to my parents I wasn't my own son. They took me from the orphanage when I was very young, right after my own mother died after giving birth to me. However, in that family where my birth mother lived, there was another boy, my older brother. This Brian the millionaire glanced at the policeman's chest, from which the doctors had pulled the huge knife with such difficulty. It was now tightly bandaged. Of course, nothing was told to my parents until the last moment, Travis continued. It wasn't until much later, as an adult, that I found out I had an older brother, Brian, somewhere. Brian was older than me by exactly 1 year. He was raised by Aunt Sharon, my own mother's sister. Travis looked first at his son, and then at Brian. So why didn't you look for him? Will asked, turning to his father. It's not that simple here either, Brian replied. Now that Travis has told me about it, I'm starting to understand something. My aunt raised me. That's true. but she never told me about having a brother. I went straight to police school after the army. That's how I became a cop. Sharon only told me before she died that she'd been silenced about the two boys, like it was the only condition for those rich parents to adopt my little brother. Otherwise, she would have to resign herself to Travis being raised in an orphanage. Of course, she didn't want that for him, so she agreed. And she couldn't afford to. We've always been very poor, so I really understand that she wanted to do what was best for Travis back. Then Brian sighed heavily. When I found out about Travis, I was in my early 30s. Who and how would I go about finding him? Especially at that point, I already knew about the adoption. That's how fate threw us together. And then there's this gang. I wanted to make this the last case of my career. I'm tired of chasing criminals. What can I say? Now it looks like I'm going to get my dream come true, just not the way I wanted it to. Brian said that the accomplices, with the help of their pseudo-economist Maggie, had already robbed several respectable families in this way. Each time the scheme was the same. Either they robbed when there was no one in the house, and then everything was done quickly, quietly, and without victims. Or if the family could not be lured out, the owners were poisoned. The latter was going to happen to Travis, but Will unwittingly took the brunt of it. And at the same time, the housekeeper was spooked for a while. Still, the loot was too big to leave like that. And then Maggie had a new plan, which Brian and the dog Taylor helped to foil. Now all robbers are waiting for decent terms. And Maggie got the worst of it, of course. She took the lives of more than 10 people with her own hands. When Brian finally recovered and came out of the hospital, his newfound family was waiting for him. His millionaire brother Travis and nephew Will, with whom he had by then already managed to really bond, although he did it in the form of a tramp guide. Crying, Brian hugged both loved ones and said happily, "We're together at last, my dears. You won't believe how much I thank God for guiding me to your very home." "Brian, darling, we're so glad," Travis exclaimed back. "You saved all three of our lives. Where would we be now if it weren't for you?" The men hugged each other again, and the embrace was imbued with the incredible power of familial love and sincere human happiness. Brian resigned from the force. He was retired with great honor, and even though he was wounded, but the farewell party was such that the local police station will remember it for a long time. Now Brian lives with his brother, nephew, and of course the dog Taylor, who is very attached to the retired lieutenant colonel. Brian does not tire of training him, thereby developing his own damaged muscles. The man is quite confident that soon he will be able to return to normal life again. Will made a full recovery after 6 months and was able to put his crutches in the storage room. Now he hopes for good. All this time Jennifer has been visiting him. The same girl from a poor family, against whom the businessman and his wife were so determined. However, when they saw the sincere dedication with which this fragile and pretty girl cared for their son, the prejudice in their hearts melted without a trace. Travis personally blessed the couple and wished the future newlyweds to never lose their freshness of feeling and respect for each other. Both he and his wife saw how their son literally shines in the presence of Jennifer, and therefore did not want to destroy their tender and so real happiness. Will and his bride got married after only 3 months. Now Jennifer is already expecting her first child and very much hopes that he will combine all the best qualities of her favorite man: kindness and love of her spouse, intelligence and foresight of her father-in-law, and incredible courage and fortitude of his brother Brian. "Uncle, will you finish your meal without thinking?" Vincent fed the little girl, and when there was a knock on the door. The sun was scorching, and the July heat was melting the asphalt. Even in the car, the smell of bitumen lingered. Vincent tolerated the odor for a while, but when invisible cats began to scratch at his throat like stone, he closed the window. But that only made things worse, because there was no room to breathe. The man cursed the weather out loud, and at the same time he cursed himself. But how long would this scorcher last? It seemed that the heavenly office had decided to wipe out the population of our planet with heat. "Well, I did a good job, too," he said to himself. "One should strike while the iron is hot. And what if we fail again, like last time? All the time I'd wasted looking for it, and I'd gotten nothing." Vincent wasn't embarrassed by the fact that he'd combined 2 expressions into one. In general, he liked to experiment in this area, and often amused his colleagues with his ingenious expressions. The thought of work was always a positive one. No, Vincent was not a workaholic, nor did he intend to burn out one day. The secret of his special attitude to his professional duties lay in 2 key points: a good salary and a close-knit team of men. More than once, Vincent found himself thinking that he was fabulously lucky, despite certain circumstances in his personal life. After all, not every man his age has an apartment, a car, and a good job. The only trouble spot was the bachelor life. He has long wanted to start a family, necessarily with several children. But unfortunately, he has not yet met a girl who would share his aspirations. A dazzling red Ferrari sped past, and a wave of air blew in through the window, which Vincent opened again as he gasped for air. What a lot of rich people there are. He commented on another example of road rage. Do they think they're allowed to do anything? Vincent had nothing against the children of the rich, but he thought that even they should not forget the mortality of human existence. Vincent had learned these simple truths from early childhood, though he did not like to remember that period of his own life. It was a good 3 hours' drive to the provincial town of Goldfields, the last point on his itinerary. Toward noon, the clouds covered the hot sun, and it was easier to breathe. Vincent opened the window fully and enjoyed the cool breeze. A picture from the distant past immediately came to mind. How he'd stood in the courtyard with his eyes closed, waiting in horror to see what would happen to him next. Vincent had been unlucky in his birthplace, or his parents. But he remembered little of his early years. The boy had existed in the full sense of the word, not lived. Along with him suffered a little sister, whose name he could not remember. His mother's face the memory did not want to show either. When he strained hard, trying to get to the farthest corners of this vault, 2 blurred spots surfaced from oblivion. The second image belonged to his stepfather, but their voices were distinct. Greg, I had another bottle in my stash. Did you steal it? Is he going to take it out on me? Greg asked his son. Maybe he stashed it. Look at the way he's looking, the wolf boy. Vincent remembered the scene well. His stepfather rose from the table and moved toward him. Vincent, Uncle Greg is telling the truth. Did you take the lemonade bottle? Tell me where you hid it, or your mommy will die, Greg said with a laugh. What's not good? Why are you scaring me? In front of a boy of 3 years of life, spank him properly. He'll tell you even what he doesn't know. Encouraged by the man, the mother hovered over the child. Vincent, said the man tiredly, I'm very scared. And he cried out, Mommy, don't hit me, please. I didn't drink your lemonade. Uncle Greg added frankly with this scene. As the situation reached its peak, he peacefully said the whole of Alabama is going to back off from the fight. Kid. He's the one who's going to shit his pants out of fear right now. Had nothing to do with it. Come closer to me and I'll show you a trick, said the man. With an imperceptible movement, he pulled a bottle from his sleeve, and to the enthusiastic shouts of his mother. Wow, Greg. You're a fucking magician. I almost punished the kid. Look, he's still shaking with fear. He'll be laughing in a minute. Right, Vincent? Uncle Greg first showed the boy his empty palm, then clenched his hand into a fist and said, You beast. We woke up by the river, and you're in the morgue, you creep. The stepfather opened his palm again, and the boy saw on it 2 caramels behind Mussolini wrappers. Hold on tight while Uncle Greg is kind and called his little sister to visit. When his stepfather was sober, he sometimes showed Vincent card tricks. The 6-year-old boy was mesmerized by the man's deft hands, but he never managed to figure out the secret of the trick. They taught me that in the zone. They're smart people there, kid, even Ph.D.S. Uncle Greg said in a satisfied tone. Vincent vividly remembered that tragic day when he and his little sister had run away from their mother's drunken company. There had been a lot of strangers in the house. Uncle Greg was very angry and ordered. Sticky children, go away somewhere. Their own freaks do not give rest, all the time tangled underfoot, and the girl in addition still yells without end. The mother was still in an adequate state and started to object. They don't bother anyone. They sit quietly in the kitchen, playing. And where am I going to take the kids? Let them go to their grandmother. And if I send them to that snake under the hood, she'll report me to the guardianship office. What, Mary? Am I going to get my parental rights revoked? That's a disaster. I'm sorry, but you're as much of a mother as I am a Chinese tea leaf picker. They can take away your parental rights, but you'll be completely free. What am I going to live on? Have you thought about that? I'm on single mom's allowance for both of them. There's not much hope for you, Greg, because today you're here and tomorrow you'll be back in the slammer. The man jumped up and went at his mother with his fists. You want me to shut you up for good? Vincent heard every last word, but understood nothing. He still didn't understand what had made him grab his little sister in his arms and run away from the house, where another scandal was brewing. Perhaps at the critical moment he triggered an innate instinct which is called intuition. But the grandmother and her acquaintances called it a miracle. When the woman saw her grandchildren on the doorstep, she proclaimed, "Again, these lousy drunks are having fun with bread. They've gone completely off the rails. They don't think about their children. It's time to put an end to this mess. Tomorrow I'll go to the guardianship office. Even in an orphanage, the kids will be better off than with a mom like that. Even though she's my daughter, I can't stand it anymore." All these claims grandmother expressed in one breath. Tired from the emotional shock, Vincent listened to her, afraid to move. If he disobeyed her, she might throw them out on the street. But Amelie, despite her harsh nature, loved and pitied her grandchildren. She washed them, then fed them and put them to bed. But their sleep didn't last long because they heard shouting outside. Then there was a loud knock on the window. "Amelie, get up. There seems to be a fire in the cul-de-sac. Didn't your prisoners set Pompeii on fire?" Grandmother jumped up and threw her coat over her nightgown. She ran out of the house with her head uncovered, saying, "Vincent, you watch your little sister. I'll run and see what's wrong." Grandma was gone for a long time, and Vincent fell asleep again. Here is the edited text with the names changed to American names. The man jumped up and moved at his mother with his fists. "It's up to you. Do you want me to shut you up for good?" Vincent heard every last word, but understood nothing. He still didn't understand what had made him grab his little sister in his arms and run away from the house, where another scandal was brewing. Perhaps at the critical moment he triggered an innate instinct, which is called intuition. But the grandmother and her acquaintances called it a miracle. When the woman saw her grandchildren on the doorstep, she proclaimed, "Again, these lousy drunks are having fun with bread. They've gone completely off the rails. They don't think about their children. It's time to put an end to this mess. Tomorrow I'll go to the guardianship office. Even in an orphanage, the kids will be better off than with a mom like that. Even though she's my daughter, I can't stand it anymore." All these claims grandmother expressed in one breath. Tired from the emotional shock, Vincent listened to her, afraid to move. If he disobeyed her, she might throw them out on the street. But Amelie, despite her harsh nature, loved and pitied her grandchildren. She washed them, then fed them and put them to bed. But their sleep didn't last long because they heard shouting outside. Then there was a loud knock on the window. "Amelie, get up. There seems to be a fire in the cul-de-sac. Didn't your prisoners set Pompeii on fire?" Grandmother jumped up and threw her coat over her nightgown. She ran out of the house with her head uncovered, saying, "Vincent, you watch your little sister. I'll run and see what's wrong." Grandmother was gone for a long time, and Vincent fell asleep again. Emily appeared when it was light outside the window. She did not cry, but often crossed herself before the images. "Lord, rest their souls and forgive their sins," she said. Amelie did not immediately notice that Vincent was awake. She came over and sat down on the edge of the bed. "You heard everything, my good man," she said to the boy. "You and Emily are orphans now. Why did such grief befall the innocent angels?" The woman shouted the last phrase in despair. Emily woke up and cried. Grandmother Amelie pressed the heads of her grandchildren to her and began to kiss them. "What is it, my dears?" "God will help us. Don't be afraid. You won't be lost with me," she comforted the children. Vincent and little Emily stayed with their grandmother. Vincent remembered the word funeral well, but he didn't have to attend the ceremony, although his sister Zendeja persuaded her. "Amelie, you can't do that. It's their mother." "Zendia, you can't say that about the dead," Amelie replied. "But Luba was a bad mother. She left nothing good in her memory. And there's no reason for the child to be at the funeral. Then I'll take them to their mother's grave to worship her. The first thing to do is to baptize them. We can't have children walking around unbaptized. I just don't know who I should ask to be my godparents." Aunt Zendaya was eager to tell them. Nayeli is a midwife by profession. I don't think she'd say no. She's family, even though she's distant. She can't have a child of her own, so at least she'll take care of orphans. And again, they're not other people's kids. Maybe then God will take pity on her and send her a child of her own? Vincent remembered the smell of candles and the priest's long prayer. Emily cried the whole time. An unfamiliar woman named Nellie rocked her in her arms. The adults repeated some words after the priest and crossed themselves. The boy liked most of all the climax of the rite, when he and his sister were put a cross around their necks. The grandmother was very satisfied that she had fulfilled her main mission. Now the children will be under the protection of the angels, she told her relatives. Aunt Zendaya grinned. And who will feed and water them? The angels? Amelie slammed her fist on the table. No blasphemy in my house. I will not give up my grandchildren. I will raise them myself. And by law, orphans are entitled to an allowance. Suddenly, Aunt Nellie intervened. She was the first person Vincent had ever heard of that there were orphanages. She said in a tone of voice that brooked no objection. Your aunt will not leave you any children. Do not even try to solve this issue in your favor. Amelie's grandmother was indignant. I have every right, because apart from me the children have no other close relatives. For what reason can I be forbidden to raise my grandchildren? Relative Tien looked at the grandmother with a cold gaze. The main reason is your age and health condition. Vincent will be placed in an orphanage. Little Emily will be placed in the children's home. Amelie was furious. What am I supposed to do? You won't do anything. This matter is under special control and no one will allow you to go against the letter of the law. Tiana cut her off. The only thing I can offer you is, well, I talked to my husband and he's fine with fostering the baby. And Vincent? How can you separate brother and sister? Just take them both. The crown won't fall off their heads. I can visit the children and help as much as I can, Amelie said pleadingly. But Aunt Nellie didn't like the idea. She fidgeted and clumsily explained why she couldn't take in 2 children. Auntie, you don't understand. My husband is a very busy man, and I'm just a free supplement to his person. That's not a joke. Stephen runs the family. I barely talked him into having a girl, so I'm afraid to imagine how he'd react to the idea of having a boy. Vincent heard all this and cried, huddled in the corner of the couch. It hurt him to be spoken of as if he were a doll to be given away. He barely waited for that nasty Aunt Nellie to speak and ran up to her. Auntie, do you look like Baba Yaga? And your Stephen is Kashi the Immortal. I won't go to live with you myself, even if you ask me to. The women looked at the boy with amazement. Aunt Nellie was the first to comment on this outburst. You can see for yourself how unruly the boy is. And this at 6 years of age. What's going to happen to him next? Aunt Zendaya tried to intercede on Vincent's behalf. It's not surprising with that kind of upbringing. In good hands, the child will do well. Aunt Nellie rolled her eyes. Perhaps. But I'm not ready for such a feat. The girl is very young, and it will be easier for us to train her. Grandma Amelie interrupted a relative. Nellie, you can train a kitten to go to the right place. You can't talk about children like that, and I doubt you'd make a loving mother. Personally, I'll be against the kids being separated. Unfortunately, no one took Grandma's opinion into account. It was only a few days later that Aunt Nellie took Emily's little sister. Vincent lived with Grandma for a little while longer, but strange women came to pick him up and took him away in a car as well. His grandmother cried as she said goodbye to him and whispered, Vincent, you take care of your cross. Don't lose it by accident. It will protect you from any misfortune. All the way he clutched that church-consecrated amulet to his breast. He must have done it so expressively that one of the accompanying women asked him affectionately, Little one, what are you there behind your sinuses? Are you crying? The second woman advised her partner, Look what's in there. Or what if he wants to sneak something nasty with him into a closed institution? Then we'll be reprimanded for it. The first woman looked him in the eye and smiled. You show me what you've got there. Vincent liked this woman immediately because she was kind. He carefully took out a small silver cross on a thin chain from her pocket. The kind official stroked his head. Thank you. You can hide everything, little one. False alarm. The child has an ordinary cross, no forbidden items. They had another long car ride, and the rest of the way Vincent thought that he would be very happy if this kind woman wanted to adopt him. But children's dreams don't always come true. Vincent spent 2 years in an orphanage. He has no good memories of this period, because every day the boy experienced humiliation from the older students of the institution, and not all educators showed cordiality and kindness to their wards. The idea to escape from the orphanage was born somewhere in Vincent's subconscious in the first days. Of course, the 6-year-old boy had little idea how to realize this plan, given that in the institution kids were under the watchful eye of educators, and it was almost impossible to do it. But despite the strict regime, there were regular escapes in the children's institution. Only the older kids dared to take such a desperate step, so Vincent had to postpone this plan until a more convenient time. The boy didn't share his intention with anyone. Only once he mentioned that he had a little sister, Emily, and wanted to run away to find her. But the fellow in distress did not hold back and told everything to Tiana. The nickname of the famous fairy tale character was given by the children to the night caretaker Tiana, who was characterized by a harmful character. Tiana first dragged Vincent out into the hallway and hung him by the collar of his shirt so that he began to choke. But for a woman with a damaged psyche, it was a pleasure to be able to abuse a child. "So, you little bastard, are you going on the run? I'll make you run away. You'll be afraid to go to the toilet?" she screamed. Vincent shouted, but no one dared to come to his aid, although a dozen or 2 kids were watching. Satisfied, Tiana went to the principal to report that the escape attempt had been thwarted. Since the boy was still very young, he was locked up in the infirmary for 10 days as punishment. Tiana came every night to see how he was doing. The woman watched him with her full face pressed tightly against the glass doors. In some wild rage, she shouted, "Are you all right there? Haven't you changed your mind about running yet? If it were up to me, I'd have you on your knees for 24 hours. Then you'd be silky smooth." Tiana added other unpleasant things like, "I wish your teeth would grow," and crooked Vincent couldn't be rude to her, because he'd get an extended sentence. Vincent endured the humiliation, silently swallowing his tears. Only at the very end of his imprisonment, Nurse Anna spotted Tiana during another act of bullying. Anna was shocked by what the employee, who was obliged by duty to take care of the children, was doing. She first tried to talk some sense into the inadequate woman. "Tiana, how can you not be ashamed? After all, he is just a child and you pour your anger on him. And what has this boy done to you?" Tiana didn't even raise an eyebrow. "Not yet, but he was about to run away. And you shouldn't feel sorry for such damaged people, because they won't grow up to be anything good anyway, unless the children of a normal mother. Maybe then a normal child would be born? And these genes are already spoiled. There's only one way to go to the zone." Anna started to chase the teacher away. "Stop this at once. I won't let you abuse a helpless child. And who are you to make such conclusions?" Tiana was already threatening Anna. Vincent heard Anna say, "That's enough, Tiana. Get out of here. I warn you, I will report your outrageous behavior to the principal today." Tiana shouted from behind the door. "I don't give a damn about your threats. I have worked here and will continue to work here, because no one will agree to wipe the snot out of these little brats for such a meager salary. That's why there's always a staff shortage in orphanages." Most likely, Anna kept her promise, because the cruel Tiana no longer appeared in the orphanage, although her departure didn't change the situation much. Vincent didn't speak frankly to anyone else. It was the first life lesson he had learned. But thoughts of his little sister Emily haunted him constantly, especially before bedtime. The boy recalled unhappy events and thought, "How is my little sister? She must be being abused by Aunt Rosa and her husband." The most surprising thing was that Vincent could never remember his sister's name. And when his parents got drunk, they just called the little girl Baby or Little One. Vincent couldn't remember the name of the town where he was born and where his mother died in a fire. The image of Amelie was also constantly in front of the child's eyes. Despite her promises, Nelly never visited him. He later learned from a caregiver that she died quietly soon after her grandchildren were taken away from her. Life at the orphanage was monotonous, except for those rare occasions when couples came to pick out a child. On such days, the older children and babies waited breathlessly to be chosen. But Vincent was terrified of the fate of being taken in by strangers, and he tried to hide away so he wouldn't be seen by prospective parents. As he moved into 3rd grade, he stopped believing in miracles. Vincent laughed at the kids who still dreamed of adoption. Don't you jerks know that all these moms and dads pretend to be nice, but they don't really need you? First, they'll take you away, and then they'll throw you in the garbage or make you beg in the subway. Since there was little support for his opinion, he had to endure a barrage of criticism after he said it. Vince, you're angry because you're not elected. Do you want to go into foster care yourself? Even the older kids felt that way. They too believed in their guiding star, dreaming of being in a healthy family. Vincent was at an early age when he couldn't understand why he was rejecting the very possibility of change in his life. It was summer vacation, and many of the children had left the orphanage for a while. Vincent was playing ball with the boys on the playground when Abby Swan came to pick him up. Vincent, I'm coming for you. Let's go to the principal's office. Why? I didn't do anything wrong. Do you have to do something bad to get into the principal's office? Sometimes you're called there for a good reason. The kid waved to his comrades. Guys, play without me for now. I'll be back soon. Here's the edited text with your edits. Abby Swan gave him a gentle nudge. I don't think it'll be soon. The puzzled boy followed the nurse and wondered, but nothing useful came to his mind. In the office where he had been only once, there were 2 other people, a man and a woman, in addition to the principal. When Vincent entered, he said a polite hello. The headmistress said with feigned cheerfulness, Here he is, our Vincent, but you can also call him as an adult Vincent Bogdanovich. So please love and welcome. The man stood up and gave the boy his hand. This is Nicholas Yurievich Brooks, and this is Rose, my wife. The guest nodded toward the woman, and she also stood up. The principal said in the same excited voice, Vincent, our guests have come specially too. But Nicholas gestured for the head of the institution to be silent. Let me do the talking. The mistress of the office did not like this dismissive attitude, and she already, without the previous optimism, said, Well, I will not interfere with you while you chat here. I'm going to go check on the food processor. When she came out, Nicholas sat Vincent down beside her and said simply, You see, brother, we've had the misfortune to have a son die of a terminal illness. It was a long time ago, but he's always in our hearts. At first, Rose and I thought we were going to live with the memories, but then we decided it wasn't right. Vincent made up his mind and looked straight into the man's eyes. Why? Because you can't wallow in your grief. It just makes you feel more alone. And then we thought it was in our power to make someone happy. Until then, Nicholas had been silent. Rose sat down next to Vincent. We've come here several times before. You may not believe this, but the first time I saw you, my heart fluttered. The boy marveled. Does it happen like that? The woman smiled. It happens, but very rarely. Only on special occasions. And this is a very special and very important moment for Nicholas and me. Vincent saw the 2 adults looking at him hopefully and anxiously. There was a warmth from them that the boy wanted to cuddle into. He asked quietly, Do you want to adopt me? Nicholas replied, See, do you understand? Our intentions are yours to decide. If you need time to think about it, we're willing to wait. You don't have to wait. You are kind. I can feel it. I agree to be your son, and I will try to obey you in everything. Rose cried and held him close to her. The woman's embrace was as gentle as Vincent's grandmother's. I wanted to sit next to her for a long, long time. It was as if Nicholas had read his mind. Thank you for giving us hope. We will try to be real parents to you. Later, when the first emotions had subsided, Nicholas said, as if by the way, to fulfill all the desires of others, it is unpleasant and harmful. We are not going to suppress your will. Personally, I am in favor of arguing, because in the dispute is born the truth. But it has to be done in a kind way. Vincent didn't understand why he was speaking so strangely. The man noticed the confusion and explained with a smile. Never keep your thoughts and feelings inside, no matter what they are. Share your joys and sorrows with us, and know that we will always help you. This assurance made the boy even more sure that he had a lucky ticket. In September, Vincent went to a new school, where he quickly settled in. The boy did not tell any of his classmates about his past life, and his foster parents praised him for that. Rose looked thoughtfully out of the window and said in a low voice, "You did a very sensible thing. People are different, some sympathize with you, and some will rejoice at your misfortune. And there is no need for outsiders to be involved in our family affairs. The most important thing is that the three of us are always happy together." Vincent liked Brooks' house very much. He felt safe and comfortable there. The boy had his own room and desk to study at. In his spare time, Vincent could play computer games or go to the martial arts training center where Nicholas had enrolled him. His foster parents didn't demand anything impossible from the boy and never imposed their own opinions on him. Everything was going well, but the first alarm bell rang at the wrong time. Vincent was getting used to his new life when Rose said, "Vincent, we're going to go to the cemetery with Nicholas. We'd like you to join us. Of course you could stay home, but..." The boy felt ashamed that this kind woman was asking him for such a small thing. "I will go with you," he answered. The woman smiled, the expression on her face that Vincent liked best. She shouted toward the kitchen. "Nicholas, I talked to Vincent. He agrees. Tell me, when are we leaving?" The foster father appeared from the kitchen and said with a satisfied look, "I'm ready. We can leave right away." The teenager had no idea what awaited him in the next half hour. The foster parents, their heads sorrowfully lowered, walked to the ornate memorial. The entire complex covered a decent-sized area, and all the elements were made of black marble. A boy about his age was looking straight at Vincent from the monument. He lowered his eyes a little lower and read, "Brooks Vincent Nicholas." The 11-year-old's consciousness was burned by the thought, which he spoke aloud. "So, your son's name was Vincent, too?" Rose smiled again. "Yes, my good man. And we wanted to find a boy who looked just like him." Vincent really wanted to run away because he didn't want to be a copy of the dead man. But his adoptive parents didn't realize their mistake. They had no idea what was going on in the child's soul at that moment. Afterwards, such events were repeated regularly, and Vincent was obliged to go with his parents to the grave of his predecessor. It was then that he realized that good, kind people didn't like him. In his free time, Vincent could play computer games or go to training in martial arts, where Nicholas immediately enrolled him. His foster parents didn't demand anything impossible from the boy and never imposed their own opinions on him. Everything was going well, but the first alarm bell rang at the wrong time. Vincent was getting used to his new life when Rose said, "Vincent, we're going to go to the cemetery with Nicholas. We'd like you to join us. Of course you could stay home, but..." The boy felt ashamed that this kind woman was asking him for such a small thing. "I will go with you," he answered. The woman smiled, the expression on her face that Vincent liked best. She shouted toward the kitchen. "Nicholas, I talked to Vincent. He agrees. Tell me, when are we leaving?" The foster father appeared from the kitchen and said with a satisfied look, "I'm ready. We can leave right away." The teenager had no idea what awaited him in the next half hour. The foster parents, their heads sorrowfully lowered, walked to the ornate memorial. The entire complex covered a decent-sized area, and all the elements were made of black marble. A boy about his age was looking straight at Vincent from the monument. He lowered his eyes a little lower and read, "Brooks Vincent Nicholas." The 11-year-old's consciousness was burned by the thought, which he spoke aloud. "So, your son's name was Vincent, too?" Rose smiled again. "Yes, my good man. And we wanted to find a boy who looked just like him." Vincent really wanted to run away because he didn't want to be a copy of the dead man. But his adoptive parents didn't realize their mistake. They had no idea what was going on in the child's soul at that moment. The boy from the orphanage served as a kind of altar for the couple, where they carried their parental love for their dead child. As Vincent grew older, he realized that he was just a sacrifice that the fanatical parents had made in honor of their dead son. This feeling was so strong that he again began to think about running away. But the boy decided not to hurry, to wait until he was of age. He now began to often lock himself in his room and shorten the time, communicating with peers and social networks. And before going to bed, as an old habit, indulged in his dreams: as soon as I finish school, I'll leave this house. I don't need their money. I won't go to the institute either. I'll find some profession that I need, but I'll find money. And this plan Vincent was able to carry out in full. At Nicholas's insistence, he applied to the Polytechnic Institute in the same city where his adoptive parents lived. But after the first half of the year, the young man said, "I'm sorry, but I don't want to be an engineer. And in general, I reviewed a lot of things in my life." Rose was confused. "Vincent, what are you talking about? You're the most important thing in our lives. You're the most important thing in our lives." The young man interrupted his foster mother. "Rose, don't kid yourself and me. You're not doing everything for me. It's for him. The one I've been replacing for so many years. I don't resent you, but I don't want to be somebody anymore. I think I've earned the right to be myself." The couple looked at him with horror and pain. For a moment, Vincent felt sorry for them, but he knew very well that he could not go on like this. Nicholas read a lot in his foster son's eyes. He asked quietly, "Do you despise us now? You will not come to us anymore?" The young man again saw that penetrating look which confused his young heart then, in the orphanage. And that pain came back to life in his soul. He put his arms around Aubrey Swan. "I'll never forget what you've done for me. And there's no one in the whole world closer to you. Please don't take offense, but I want to make my own life. And I'll visit you, because you're my parents too." Vincent made some useful acquaintances at the institute, and one of the faculty members helped him enroll in a college that trained specialists for the defense industry. The uniqueness of this form of education was that you could work and learn a very rare profession at the same time. Housing was also provided to all employees of the company on a rental basis. In 10 years, Vincent already had his own one-room apartment. However, his foster parents helped him buy it, and he had recently bought the car he had dreamed of for many years. Houston was behind him, and Vince returned once more to the Navigator. Canyon City was less than 50 kilometers away. The excitement grew as he neared his final destination, and the man whispered, "I wonder what awaits me in a town with such an unusual name. Would I not find my sister there? Thank goodness I have her information now." Vincent spent years searching for her. He tried to locate his sister through the orphanage where he had spent only 3 years. But he was at first firmly refused this favor when he asked at least for the name of the town where he used to live. The lady in the clerk's office gave him a stern look and declared, "We are not authorized to divulge confidential information." Vince tried to explain to the woman, "You misunderstand me. I'm trying to find out information that concerns me directly. I wasn't 6 years old when my sister and I were separated, and now I want to find her. I think that's a normal desire. And I'm just asking you to help me a little." The lady hesitated for a long time, but then gave in. She first looked back at the door of her office, and then she drew the name of the township on a piece of paper. "It's a town, but 300 kilometers from here. Maybe someone there can tell you where your sister is." Vincent wasted no time and headed for the district town where he had spent the first years of his life. When he arrived, his memory began to jog his memory, and he found the cul-de-sac where he used to live with his mother. The burnt house was now a weedy wasteland. Suddenly, an elderly woman approached him. "Are you looking for someone? Maybe I can help you?" "I don't think you can help me. It's been over 20 years. I lived in a house that burned down, and I had a little sister." The woman clutched at her heart. "Oh my God, if it isn't you, Vincent, how grown up and handsome. A real one." The young man did not expect such a strong reaction and embarrassedly said, "It's me. You're not mistaken, are you?" He tried to smile, but it didn't come out well, and he only wrinkled his nose as if he had eaten a lemon. The woman wailed again. The way was hard. Your mother is your own blood, but I still feel sorry for her. It was an unenviable fate for her, and the girl Kira was taken away by a relative. Do you know where she lives? The woman waved her hands in despair. What are you? How should I know? He was about to leave, but the woman stopped him. If you go to your grandmother, she's also long gone. The house has been bought by newcomers. Talk to them. Maybe they'll tell you where to find your sister. Vincent went on his way, but the woman caught up with him again. Old age is no fun. It just slipped my mind. Go to Zendaya. She knows exactly where the girl has been taken. Vincent was surprised that he had forgotten about Aunt Zendaya, who was almost always at his grandmother's house. But he'd found her place of residence after a long wander among the low-rise houses that dominated the neighborhood. He went up to the second floor and rang for a long time at apartment number 5. No one answered, and Vincent wanted to leave. When he heard footsteps approaching the door, after a moment's hesitation, the man called out, "I'm looking for Aunt Zendaya." From outside the door, they also shouted, "I don't have any nephews, and I don't open to crooks." The footsteps began to move away, and Vincent had to shout half a tone louder, "Aunt Zendaya. I'm Vincent, Amélie's grandson. You must remember me." Footsteps returned to the door. While the landlady fiddled with the lock, a middle-aged, tall, gray-haired man looked out of the next apartment. "You mustn't believe her fantasies, or she'll say things that will blow your mind." Vincent didn't have time to say anything, because Zendaya herself interrupted his neighbor's remarks. He could hardly recognize the old woman who had bent down and made the obscene gesture as the stately woman who often appeared at his grandmother's house. The obscene gesture Aunt Zendaya complimented it with insults against the man. "Are you the one who is not at home?" "I'm still fine with my head. I don't steal gasoline from the neighbors' cars at night, and I don't run around with girls." The man's face was flushed with paint, and he slammed the door shut with a bang. But the cheerful, revenge-seeking old woman came to the neighbor's door and showed another obscene gesture through the peephole. Satisfied with herself, she invited Vincent into the apartment, which was a mess. Because of the mess, the woman didn't even offer him a seat. They stood in the hallway, and she tried to get a good look at him in the dim light of a low-wattage bulb. When the viewing was over, the old woman asked with undisguised irritation, "Well, tell me, why did you come? You see how I live, and nobody cares about me." Sensing that Aunt Zendaya was about to turn the conversation to her personal problems, Vincent told her the purpose of his visit. The old woman perked up at once. "Why didn't you tell me what you were doing?" "You're looking for Kira, her. After her aunt took her away, I never heard from her. You should be looking for your aunt in Los Angeles. I don't remember the name of the city where she wrote to me, but I still have a card from her congratulating me on March 8th. The old lady hurried into the room and soon returned with a postcard. "Here you are. I don't need it. I haven't written a letter to anyone in a long time." Vincent took the card from Aunt Zendaya's hands and ran his eyes over the address. He could tell by the determined look on her face that she wasn't going to be hospitable. He took 2 5,000 bills out of his wallet and handed them to the old woman. "Here, buy yourself something tasty." The old woman smiled, but she clutched the money in her fist. "Vincent, are you leaving already? Can't we at least have a cup of tea together?" But the young man politely declined the offer. After such a cold reception, he had no desire to be stuck with his relative, and the atmosphere in the apartment did not dispose to cultural rest. On the street at the entrance, he saw a neighbor whom his grandmother had called bad names. He glanced at him. "I thought you were from the authorities, but it turns out a very distant relative. But whether she is your relative at all, I don't know exactly." The man was disappointed by the answer. "I was thinking that you will take to yourself this crazy, get rid of us from the evil neighbor. She has poisoned our whole life. She sleeps during the day and watches the street at night. She thought she saw the fuel being drained. But the worst part is the way she talks. Vincent knew exactly what this man wanted from him, but he said firmly, "Contact the police or social services. They will definitely take action." The man was stunned. "But she's your relative. Don't you feel sorry for your grandmother? If I remember correctly, Aunt Zendaya has children. Let them take care of her." He turned around and walked away from the yard, but he was caught up by the cry of a disgruntled man. "Wait. They'll give you the old man's ass in your old age." Vincent grinned to himself, remembering the same gesture Zendaya's grandmother had shown her neighbor. Suddenly a bitter lump came to his throat. He remembered staring out the window for hours, waiting for some of his family to come and visit him at the orphanage. But everyone had forgotten about him. And Aunt Zendaya, too, had never once remembered this nephew's existence. He went to the address his relative had given him at once, but disappointment awaited him there. The aunt and her family had left 12 years ago to the place of her husband's new destination. The line had been severed, and Vincent didn't know what to do next. As he tried to collect his thoughts, an inner voice awoke. "Go to your father. He can help." Vincent had never considered that option. He'd kept the fact that he had a younger sister from his foster parents. The reason for this distrust lay in his distant childhood. He remembered the day of the funeral and how Aunt Nellie had said she didn't want a 6-year-old boy as an extra burden. And he was afraid that if he told his sister's foster parents, they would be, at best, less than thrilled to hear the news. Later, when Vincent was an adult, it didn't make sense to tell them the big secret. But when he found himself at an impasse, the young man realized that his foster father's help could actually have a positive result, because Nicholas had connections even in the internal organs. His parents greeted him with genuine joy. Abi Swan couldn't get enough of him. "Vincent, thank you for coming. You have no idea how much we missed you." Although Nicholas was not as excited, he was also visibly overflowing with positive emotions. "Son, I'm sorry, but I won't believe that you just showed up. I've learned all your gestures for all the years you've lived with us, and I can see that you're very puzzled about something. What's your business?" Vincent summarized the problem. But the more he went on, the more surprised his father became. Then he asked with a hidden resentment, "Why didn't you say something all this time? If you had told me earlier, we would have found your sister long ago. Are Mom and I such scary people that you were afraid to confide in us?" Vincent felt ashamed of his past suspicions. Only now did he realize that, in spite of his difficulties, these people really loved him. And he didn't hold back. "Forgive me, but I used to think you loved your son, not me." Tears glistened in Abi Swan's eyes. She pressed his head to her breast, as if she were a child. "You've grown up, but you're still the same fool. How can you fake a love that doesn't exist?" Vincent closed his eyes, savoring the warmth that radiated from this woman. His senses overflowed and he wanted out. So he put his lips to Abi Swan's hands and asked softly, "Mommy, forgive me. I'm really a total dumbass." Nicholas watched this touching scene from the sidelines. Vincent thought for a moment that he too had tears in his eyes, but the man quickly got over his feelings. He said cheerfully, "Now, as punishment for your unworthy behavior, you'll have to stay with us for a week." "I'm sorry, Father, but only 3 days. I can't do more. I took a vacation to look for my sister. So every day counts." "Well, don't make excuses. I'll try to get some information." Nicholas kept his promise, and it took him only 2 days to find out the whereabouts of Kira Wilder. Aunt Nellie and her husband had adopted the girl, and now she had a different middle name, Stevenson. True, Vincent was not sure that the owner of this personal data is his own sister, so the guest period at the foster parents' house had to be shortened. As he said goodbye, Nicholas asked, "Vincent, maybe I should come with you. You know I'm going on a training camp soon." "No, Father, you shouldn't risk your health. It's a long journey, and the heat's so hot even the young can't stand it. I'll keep you informed. I'll be sure to let you know when it's all cleared up." "Okay, I'll take you up on that." The next morning, Vincent hit the road. Gornozavadsk did not make a favorable impression on Vincent. It was a small provincial town that lived a measured life. When he reached his destination, the heat of midday had changed to a light evening chill, and the locals were going about their business. They gave him a few leering glances, but no one asked him anything. Vincent's first order of business was to get a place to sleep, and he asked a woman who was passing by, "Can you tell me where you have a decent hotel around here?" The woman laughed for some reason. "No, we have a hotel and a hotel are the same thing. It's just around the corner." He went in the indicated direction and in 10 minutes checked in, leaving his things in a single room, which the receptionist proudly called suite. The man decided to take a walk. For a whole day of traveling, he was very tired and hungry. But there were no vacancies in the restaurant, which was located on the first floor of the hotel. Vincent cursed without anger. What a province. I guess the locals like to have a good time. He looked around and saw a kiosk with a crowd of people near it. Vincent walked over to the kiosk and smelled the distinctive aroma of an oriental dish. His memory immediately responded to that familiar gastronomic odor. He remembered walking with his little sister Becky and his mother in the park when he was a child, and they were also selling shawarma. He asked hopefully, "Mommy, it smells so good, will you buy us some?" His mother tugged his arm painfully. "I don't have money for such delicacies. Eat what you're given. And don't get distracted." Vincent still remembered how his mouth filled with saliva and his stomach rumbled loudly. His mother had dragged him and his sister away from the deli stand, but he'd looked around and seen strangers eating shawarma and drinking Coca-Cola. Perhaps it was the memory of an unsatisfied childhood desire that awakened a vicious appetite and hunger. He ordered a double portion. The satisfied stall owner began to fuss, anticipating a generous tip. He quickly prepared the order and wished the unfamiliar customer, "Eat to your heart's content. I have the most delicious shawarma. You will eat today and you will come back tomorrow." Vincent thanked the talkative businessman and sat down at a free table, but it seemed that he had overdone it because he was quickly satiated with the colorful dish. There was still a second portion left untouched on the disposable plates. He was about to leave when suddenly a timid voice was heard nearby. "Uncle, if you don't eat, can I eat this?" He turned sharply and saw a skinny girl about 6 or 7 years old. The little girl was staring greedily at her plate, and that look made Vincent a little uncomfortable. "Wait, little girl, why finish it? I'll order you a new one. Why don't you sit here?" He was sickened by the thought of the girl eating the shawarma in front of him. He rushed to the kiosk and asked the clerk, "Another portion, please, and a bottle of water." While he was at the kiosk, the girl sat peacefully at the table and kept her eyes on the plate of food. The owner himself brought a fresh portion. "Help yourself, please." The girl ate very carefully. She was careful not to drop a single crumb, wiping her fingers with a napkin. Vincent thought that this little girl had been taught proper table manners, indicating a good upbringing. Children from dysfunctional families don't usually have these skills. But he didn't feel comfortable asking her questions, so he waited for the right moment. His body was sweating from the incomprehensible excitement. Vincent took out a handkerchief and rubbed his neck vigorously. The sudden movement made his cross pop out. The girl stopped chewing and stared at the cross. "Is it yours?" Vincent nodded. "Yes. I had a little sister when I was little, and we were baptized together in church by my grandmother. It's my most prized possession. I've worn it all my life. You like it?" "Yes, I like it very much." The girl carefully wiped her hands and carefully pushed the empty plate away. She looked at Vincent and suddenly said, "My name is Emily." The man extended his right hand to her. "Nice to meet you." "I'm Vincent. I'm here on very important business and I was hungry, so I thought I'd grab a bite to eat. How far away do you live? Maybe I should walk you home." "It's late. My parents will be worried." The girl didn't answer. Vincent interpreted her silence as a child's reluctance to reveal where she lived. "Your mother doesn't let you talk to strange men, does she?" The girl nodded affirmatively. Your mom is good. She's right, because casual acquaintances can be dangerous for little girls. Listen, you and I will do this. I'll go to the store. Buy you something tasty. You wait here for me. Deal?" The girl nodded again in agreement. Not far from the kiosk, the sign of the shopping center was shining, and the man headed there. He quickly bought a small set of groceries and ran back to the kiosk. But the girl was no longer there. "She's gone," Vincent sighed. He glanced at the table where he'd been indulging in his gastronomic pleasure. The plate of shawarma he hadn't eaten was empty too. Vincent realized that the girl had taken the rest of his dinner with her. Poor thing. Why did she run away? Where am I supposed to put all this food? A little frustrated, he headed toward the hotel and placed the bag of groceries in the refrigerator in his room. After a tiring day, he showered and went to bed. Sleep immediately hit him. He was awakened by a cautious knock on his door. The sweet sleep didn't want to let him go, so Vincent looked at the clock, then out the window. My God, it was only 8:30. Who's come to get me this early? Probably the maids. The knocking came again, and he had to get up. What was his surprise when, opening the door, he saw Emily, the girl from yesterday. The little girl said politely, "Good morning. My aunt told me you lived here." The little girl pointed toward the front desk. Vincent had no choice but to invite her into his room. "You're here for a reason, aren't you?" Emily looked at him with wide eyes. There was something painfully familiar in that childish gaze. The girl was scrutinizing him, too. After a long pause, she said, "My mother sent me to you. She is very sick now, so she cannot come herself." "And why did your mother send you to me?" "We don't know each other at all." Vincent was amused at this ridiculous suggestion, but the little guest suddenly cried. "Mommy wanted to go herself, but she's not feeling well. She didn't get sick before and she went to work. We had plenty of food. Mommy always bought me ice cream on Sunday, but now she can't even get up. What would happen if Mommy died?" Vincent rushed over to the baby and began to comfort her. "Emily, please don't cry. I'll get my things together and we'll go to your mommy. And you sit here for now." The man sat the still sobbing girl in the chair. He really wanted to distract her from her sad thoughts. "Listen, Emily. You ran away yesterday, and I bought a whole bag of food for you. You haven't had breakfast yet." Vincent went to the refrigerator and pulled out a bag of colorful pictures. "Here, see what's in there. I'm going to wash up." The girl's face perked up at the sight of the food package and she began to examine its contents. Vincent spent no more than 5 minutes on his morning routine. When he was back in the room, the guest was eating a muffin with gusto. The man marveled once more at the child's thinness, but said cheerfully, "That's it. I'm ready. Take me to your mom." They wandered through the streets of the town until they came to the outskirts, where small houses huddled together. The private sector made Vincent's eyes grow dull. Until that day, life had never thrown him into such sad places. He was more accustomed to the tidy appearance of country villages. Here, poverty screamed from almost every house. Emily took his hand. "We live on an apartment in that house." The girl pointed with her hand at a dilapidated structure, painted in dark blue. The window caps, contrary to the notion of harmony, were painted in a poisonous orange color. Vincent was impressed by this unusual palette and thought, what a tasteless thing to do. What a wild combination. But he didn't have time to say what he thought, because Emily beat him to it. "Isn't it beautiful? My mom painted it. The landlady asked her to paint it. But she wouldn't give me the money for the paint. My mom cried. Then Uncle Sergey brought us 2 buckets of paint." Vincent only nodded, because he wasn't going to memorize the names of complete strangers. He did not ask who Uncle Sergey was, but the girl herself revealed the secret of this character. "Uncle Sergey is our neighbor. He works at the construction site. He has a wife, Aunt Olga. She also sometimes helps us. They always feel sorry for my mom, because she is an orphan. And I'm an orphan too, because I don't have a daddy." Vincent interrupted the girl. "You have a mom, so you're not an orphan." At this point they reached the gate, which was barely holding. Don't open it too much, or it'll break off again. There's no one to repair it, Emily warned. Uncle Sergei, you said yourself that he helps you. He helps, but not for nothing. And now we don't even have money for bread because my mom doesn't work. As they wandered through the nooks and crannies of the private sector, the sun was already high and burning the ground. Vincent was anxious to get away from the heat, but as soon as he crossed the threshold of the house, the smell of mold and mustiness hit his nose. The man couldn't help but grimace. Emily looked at him understandingly and explained the origin of the odor. I don't like the way it smells in here either. My mom says a fungus ate the house, but the landlady doesn't charge us much rent. A woman's cold voice came from far away. Emily, did you come alone? Came a woman's voice. Vincent stepped forward with determination. No, I'm here to visit. He walked from the dark hallway into a brighter, smaller room. Emily said you wanted to see me, and I'd like to know why you're so interested in me, Vincent began, but stopped short. Because the same eyes as Emily's were looking at him from under the blanket. But there was something else about the woman's pained face that made him wince. It was a prominent scar above her right eyebrow, the exact same mark his little sister had. They stared at each other for a long moment. Then Emily's mother opened her palm and Vincent saw a cross just like his. Emily told me that the kind man who fed her had the same cross. That's why I asked her. The man immediately understood everything and rushed to the bedside. Marina. Sis, if you knew how long I was looking for you. The woman from excitement strongly coughed. Are you my brother? But my aunt did not say anything to me. I didn't even know I had a brother. A new fit of coughing prevented the woman from speaking. Vincent looked at her sympathetically, then at Emily. We need to get your mom better first, and then we can talk. What do you think, Emily? The girl rushed to him. Mommy's brother, you're not leaving? Of course not, little girl. I didn't come looking for you so long to leave at once. I can't leave you in such a difficult situation. Emily, will you stay here with Mommy? I won't be long. Vincent went to the neighboring house, where, according to the girl, lived a kind Uncle Igor, who had sold them paint cheaply. A neighbor with a doll on her head was waiting for him at the gate. She gave Vincent an appraising look. What are you, the neighbor's new boyfriend? No, I'm her brother. Does she often have men over? The neighbor's eyes widened. God forbid. I'd never seen one. Then why the questions? Yes, that's what I thought, Vincent nodded. She's a lonely woman who needs a man, she said, clearly flirting. But Vincent wasn't interested in compliments. Kira's very sick. Can you tell me how to call a doctor? The smile disappeared instantly from the woman's face. I'll be right back. The neighbor ran briskly down the path to the house, but stopped halfway. What's wrong with her? What are her symptoms? When you call an ambulance, they always ask about that. A bad cough and a fever. For about an hour, they waited for the paramedics. The doctor first examined the woman with a critical eye, and when he listened to her lungs, he said in an anxious voice, There is wheezing on both sides. We need urgent hospitalization. Despite the treatment, Kira's condition remained serious. Vincent had to stay in town because he had no one to leave little Dariana with. When Kira felt a little better, she told her brother her story. As she recounted her misadventures, the man's fists clenched tighter and tighter. Kira hadn't even been 3 years old when the tragedy had struck, so she didn't have the meager memories that had helped Vincent find her. Her aunt had taken the girl with her to the other side of the world, where her husband worked. Stephen didn't work in the usual sense of the word. The man was the owner of one of the mining companies. In the dashing 90s, he managed to orient himself correctly, and now enjoyed all the benefits of life. After all, the company steadily brought income, which provided a constant growth of personal capitals of Stephen's family. The businessman gave his consent to the adoption of an absolutely alien to him girl not out of compassion for the unfortunate child. He pursued a completely different goal to create a positive image. Therefore, this event he did not hide from the public, But on the contrary, he arranged a grand celebration on this occasion. About the good heart of Stephen and his wife, then a month wrote in newspapers and told on television. In a word, the PR campaign was successful. The reputation of the businessman only strengthened. The man even praised his wife for it. Amelie is a clever girl. She came up with the idea. I wouldn't have thought of it myself. Now I can safely run for governor, Stephen said. Nellie was afraid of her husband in her heart, because during their 15 years together he had repeatedly shown his despotic character. She would never have dared to offer to foster another man's child. But she liked the unfortunate woman's daughter very much. Nellie did not expect her husband to give his consent so quickly and began to hurry with the paperwork. With her connections, it was possible to pass this procedure quickly. But Nellie, for fear of angering her husband, did not tell him what family the girl came from. The truth was revealed 5 years later. Kira, for the rest of her life, remembered this terrible scene, when Stephen in anger shouted at his wife. "You have no idea how you set me up. What the hell were you thinking when you took a girl from an alcoholic mother? There's no telling how bad heredity will play out in the future." Nellie was trying to justify what she'd done. "But Steve, it's not the kid's fault he has a mother like that." The man became even more furious. "I don't care about her at all. Don't try to make me feel sorry for her. It won't work. But I ask that from this day on, this woman does not come into my sight. Where can I put her? It's been years," Nellie pleaded. "Give her to an orphanage. If you have nothing better to do, get a dog. All the ladies of high society do that." Nellie tried to make one last but most powerful argument. "Steve, imagine how happy the tabloids will be when it's revealed that you've given the poor kid up to the orphanage. They'll talk about your name for a year, or even more, and it will reflect badly on your future career." Stephen slumped back in his chair. "You're right, aren't you? For the first time, I have to admit it. Still, try to keep the girl out of my sight. Let her live in the country, help our housekeeper. It'll do her some good." The next day, Nellie took the girl to the country village. Kira was crying. The foster mother first affectionately, then with irritation calmed her down. "Why are you crying? You are incredibly lucky that you have fallen into good hands. And nothing will happen to you if you live in the village. There's a school there. You'll study, you'll make new friends." For 2 months, Kira got used to life in a new place. She was lucky that her housekeeper Vivian treated her well. Once a month on weekends, the foster parents came to the cottage, and then Kira went to live in the outhouse. Stephen had ordered it. But life prepared a new test for the orphan. She was about 10 years old when Vivian said in passing, "I don't know why, Kira. All the trouble is falling on your poor head." The girl froze with a bad feeling. Something happened to Nellie's mom, didn't it? It did. They'd have a baby of their own. Kira was too young to understand the dangers of having another baby in a businessman's family. But she remained in ignorance for a short time. Suddenly, in the middle of the week, Stephen himself appeared and ordered the housekeeper. "Vivian, pack up the girl and I'll take her into town with me." The woman rushed to fulfill the errand. The man looked at the girl with an unkind look. "She's all grown up. It's time to repay the money spent on you. Will you look after your brother?" Kira was afraid to argue, but still asked. "What about school?" "They promised to send my drawings to a competition." Stephen laughed. He laughed until he was in tears, and afterwards he even stroked Kira's head. "Thank you for making me laugh. Although my mood has lifted a bit. I didn't even know I had a budding talent in the house. Another Picasso on the rise. Now seriously, you'll still go to school, of course, but I can't promise you any other hobbies." Kira hadn't enjoyed life much before, but she never thought that her existence could one day turn into a real hell. Little Emin was only 3 months old, but he was a big, strong boy. The baby had a capricious nature and demanded to be carried in her arms. For a teenage girl, this became an impossible responsibility. Her back and arms ached. One day she complained to Nellie. "Emin is so heavy, I can't lift him." The woman looked angrily at her adopted daughter. "What did you just say that for? Do you think I will cry out of pity for you? Do you like eating for free? You don't like babysitting your brother. It can't be helped." After Eamon's birth, Nayli's attitude towards the girl changed a lot. If before she sometimes showed pity and compassion, now she was always yelling at Kira, and sometimes she used her fists. Once the girl was late at school because they had an event dedicated to Women's Day. She had prepared a gift for Nayli, a small box made of paper and painted with patterns. Everyone in the class looked at her work with delight, and the teacher even said, "What a lovely thing. Your mother will be so happy." But Nayli met Kira at the door. The look on her face didn't bode well. "Where have you been?" "Almost 2 hours late. I had an appointment at the beauty parlor." The girl handed her mother an original gift. "We had a celebration at school. We congratulated Mom. This is a present for you." Nayli threw the box on the floor and started stomping on it. "I don't want your presents. Take your box to your dead mother's grave. Let her be happy in the next world." Kira rushed to save her work, and the angry woman roughly threw her aside. The girl hit the door jamb painfully and screamed. Rose bent over her. "Why are you yelling like a baby? You'll wake the baby." Eamon was crying in the nursery, and Kira had to go to soothe the baby. All day long she cried. In her soul she hated the boy, because of whom her life had become a living hell. In the evening, Nayli came into her room. "If you're late again, you'll kick me out of the house. Do you understand?" Nayli asked threateningly. Kira whispered quietly. "Understood, Mommy. And stop calling me Mommy. You're just like that to me. You're not a mare's tail. I have my own son. Thank God." Nayli cut her off. That was the final verdict for Kira's future. Since there was no help for her, she began to think about how she could escape from slavery. Of course, the girl could not even dream of entering the institute. Stephen himself ordered her fate when school was coming to an end. "Will you go to college? At least you'll get some kind of profession. Nayli, see where you can get her a job so she can earn a living. It's time for her to be on her own. You've been supporting her for too long." Nayli got the girl into a construction college. Bricklaying is a lucrative profession. If you're not stupid, you'll always have money. There's a comfortable dormitory. You'll get a scholarship. Nayli made it clear that Kira was no longer welcome in their home. Even Eamon, whom she had raised, was openly mocking. "For losers like you, the only place for losers like you is on the construction site or in the garbage dump. And I'll become a businessman, because my dad has no money." Kira did not want to argue with a spoiled boy. Soon she packed her things and moved into the college dormitory. Contrary to anxious expectations, within the walls of the educational institution she waited for an interesting life. There were constantly held exciting events, hobby groups. Kira immediately enrolled in the art studio, where her talent was noticed by a young teacher, Richard. This guy worked at the college for only a year, but during this time he managed to get an army of admirers. Girls deliberately visited his studio to talk to the attractive master. Kira also secretly sighs for him, but even afraid to hope for reciprocity from Richard. The young teacher, though he behaved with restraint, did not refuse the attention of female students. He tried to give time to each admirer, but it did not come to a serious relationship. The girls in the group sighed enviously. Lucky to be the one who wins Richard's heart. His mom is also a college professor, and his dad is in a high position. Kira also sighed furtively, but never entered into such conversations. The girl cherished the rare minutes and hours that Richard devoted to her personally. After all, her works were sent to regional exhibitions, where they always took first place. Therefore, the teacher considered it his duty to develop the talent of his ward to perfection. One day he left Kira after class. "Kira, I have a suggestion for you. Would you like to study on an individual program?" "I'd like that very much. And rightly so. You have certain abilities, but they need to be developed to develop them into a talent. I admit, I'm also fond of painting and I have my own studio. My father financed it, so I can in my free time to study with you." The girl was confused. "But Richard, I don't have the means to pay for such lessons." The young man exclaimed with excitement. Altruistic. Don't you dare even think about money. It was a magical time. Kira rushed to Richard's studio every evening after college. At first, they only did creative work, but one day he himself suggested a little walk before going to bed. Then they went to the movies together. And once the man even invited her to a restaurant. Naive girl knew nothing about the intrigues of courtship. She thought that Richard was enchanted by her and would soon propose. So she agreed to continue the evening after the restaurant in his studio. A glass of champagne, to put her guard down. And she melted into the arms of the experienced lover. After that unforgettable night, Richard became even more insistent in courting the girl. He gave her flowers and small gifts. In Kira's ears already sounded the wedding march, when suddenly came sobering. After 2 months of secret meetings in the studio, the girl realized that she was pregnant. She expected Richard to take this news with joy. But the man clutched his head. Kira. How could this have happened? You're not a young girl who doesn't know about contraception, Richard said reproachfully. Kira was confused. But I really don't know about it. And then I thought you'd be pleased. Glad? What do you mean? A baby. Did you really think I'd marry you? I'm sorry, but I already have a fiancé, and we're getting married this summer. Richard, what about me? What am I supposed to do? That's not my problem. Ask the girls in your group, they'll tell you where to go. But don't talk to me again. And we need to stop seeing each other. Kira did not immediately understand the meaning of the words spoken by his favorite man. She still in her heart hoped that he would change his mind and call her. But Richard defiantly avoided the girl, and soon came to the end of her studies in college. Kira did not tell any of her fellow students about her trouble. She decided to turn to Nayli for help. But when her foster mom found out about her situation, she wouldn't even let her in the house. I knew it. I had a gut feeling this was going to happen. How can a bad seed grow into a good plant? Go, Kira, and deal with your own problems. I have enough to worry about with Dick. The girl was desperate. She didn't know what to do or how to act. Suddenly she remembered her housekeeper, Vivian, and at her own risk went to her in the country. Although this woman was not known for her kindness, she still sheltered the pregnant girl. I won't refuse to help you, of course, because that would be inhumane. But I warn you, be quiet and don't bring anyone to my house. You realize you don't belong in a businessman's house. My house is not luxurious, but it's a good place to live. So Kira stayed with Vivian until the birth of her daughter. They did not need money, because Kira worked part-time as a repairman at private cottages. One day Vivian gave Kira a good idea. I have a childhood friend who lives in Durham. I want to move there in my old age. If you're interested, come with me. I'm sure there's a job for you there, and I'll look after Gracie. I'm getting used to the girl. I'm used to you too. You're like family to me now. Soon they moved to a small town. Vivian didn't stay long in the new place. The climate there was bad for her health, and after a year or so the woman died suddenly, and Kira was left alone again with a small child in her arms. A friend of the deceased patroness was not so merciful, but did not kick out a single mother with a child on the street. She offered Kira favorable, in her opinion, terms of rent of dilapidated housing. But she was glad for the opportunity. While Vince listened to his sister's story, he had experienced a whole range of feelings. But now he realized he'd been luckier than the fragile, teenage-looking woman. Kira was breathing heavily, exhausted from the experience and the long conversation. He leaned over her. It's all behind you, sister. We'll be together now. He pulled his cross from behind his back and kissed it. I marvel at the foresight of old people. If our grandmother hadn't wanted to baptize us then, we probably wouldn't have found each other. Did you pay attention to the downside? Kira smiled through her strength. Yes, my name is engraved there. The first time I saw it was when I was still out of school, but I wouldn't show my cross to Nayli. I was afraid she'd take it away from me. She never told me anything about you or Grandma. While they were talking, Dariana was busy with her dolls. Vincent gave his niece 2 dolls with sets of clothes. The girl was delighted with the gift. Wow, I have 2 girlfriends now. The girls will die of envy. In addition to the toys, Vincent bought her a tracksuit and a beautiful dress. The little girl liked the clothes too. Uncle Vincent, do you have a lot of money? Why do you spend money on us? It's my pleasure to spend money on such wonderful girls. I'll tell you a secret. When we get home, I'll buy you so many clothes that they won't fit in your closet. Dariana squealed with delight. Kira asked anxiously, "Do you want to take us back to your place?" Big Brother asked, "Do you have other plans? How can I leave you here alone? Why do you have to worry?" The man became serious. "Kira, let's make a deal that from this day forward, you will never ask me stupid questions again. Do you really think I've been looking for you for so long just to leave you? You have no idea how much I've prayed to God or the angels all these years. I don't remember anymore, but my main dream was to find you." Kira smiled, a blush appearing on her weary face for the first time in days. "Vince, I will obey you in everything. I want to tell you, too, that even now I'm afraid to believe I'm happy." The Swan family was about to leave for the town market when the doorbell rang. Abby looked at her husband suspiciously. "Nicholas, who could it be? Or again your domino partners showed up?" The man began to persistently refute this version. "What are you immediately on me? Maybe it's someone from the neighbors came for salt, or someone ran out of laundry detergent." "Don't look at me like that. Open the door." Abby headed for the hallway with a disgruntled look, but she was immediately shouted at. "Vincent, you're unannounced as usual. My father and I almost went to the market." Nicholas also came out to greet the long-awaited guest. Vincent made his way to his parents' apartment, and not alone. "Kira, Dariana, don't be afraid, come in. He's found his sister after all. Well done. You did the manly thing." The arrival of the guests startled the couple, but it was Abby who was the most excited. "What's the market now? We'll send the men out for groceries, and we'll make a nice healthy meal." "Dariana, will you help Grandma Abby?" "Yeah, I'm always helping my mom, and I can even peel potatoes." "That's fine, but I'm not going to give you a sharp knife just yet. You'll be our backup," said Abby. "And you, Kira, feel free to get used to it. We're a family now." A year passed. Indeed, Kira and Dariana had found a real family. Vincent wanted them to live in his apartment, but the foster parents didn't want to let the girls go. They were so attached to them, they couldn't imagine life without them. "Let them stay with us. We've already found a school, and there will be a job for Kira," Nicholas said. He himself took care of the girl's employment. She started working as a restorer at a historical site. There the young woman met an artist who soon proposed to her. In short, everyone's life got better. Only Vincent himself continued to be a bachelor. But the man knew that he still had the most interesting things ahead of him. It was just that the angels had not yet sung a song for him. Running away from ungrateful children into the wilderness, Margaret found a photo in the attic. The school's small assembly hall was filled with students in resplendent prom dresses and fancy suits with tied ribbons. They took turns on the stage, where a tall, formidable woman with a joyful smile of the principal handed them their diplomas. A short woman in dark glasses and a long green dress stood next to her. She hugged everyone who received the cherished book and cried on their shoulder. "The gold medal for excellent studies goes to Margaret Swan," the principal said loudly into the microphone. A skinny girl in a red dress, in the color of her certificate, and with a long white braid rose from the hall and headed to the stage. She was given a medal, red certificates, and a small bunch of flowers. The girl went up to her class teacher, a woman in a long green dress. "My dear child, how happy I am for you." The woman hugged Margaret. "You have a brilliant future ahead of you. I'm sure you are smart, kind, purposeful. You will definitely achieve everything you want. Do you understand?" The girl often nodded and hugged her class teacher. "Thank you for everything." Margaret came down from the stage and sat down in the hall, continuing to watch the awarding of certificates. Suddenly someone jumped up to her and whispered something in her ear. Margaret opened her eyes wide and jumped up from her seat. She had decided to leave the child in the orphanage. "Do you understand?" shouted the girl's mother. "We must do something, not sit here." "Let's go," ordered Margaret, and they ran towards the house, which was not far away. The girl ran into the house and saw her older sister, who had already packed a bag for the baby and was holding the girl in her arms. "Vivi, what are you going to do? You're not just going to leave this girl at the orphanage, are you?" Margaret asked hopefully, looking at her sister, who had gathered her long dark hair into a thick braid and was wearing a tracksuit. She was unattractive now, not like herself, the usually bright and stately girl around whom crowds of boys hovered. "You don't understand." Margaret Vivi shook the baby. "It's what keeps me from living my life. It's draining me of all my strength, and it's screaming all the time. And I can't take it anymore," Vivi said indignantly. "It's driving me crazy, making me act like I'm a freak." Margaret approached her sister slowly, shaking her head. "It's her, not it. How do you not understand? It's a child. You can't just do that to it. You can't abandon her, you can't put her in an orphanage, do you understand?" the girl said almost pitifully. "Then take her for yourself." Vivi put the crying girl in Margaret's arms. "Spare me the screaming and the crying and all that. I don't want it. I don't want to hear her howling every night." Without hearing her sister's reply, Vivi walked over and shoved the bag with the baby's things into her hands. "Look, you can't leave her," Margaret exclaimed, looking into the girl's big blue eyes. "What do you mean I can't?" "I can give her anywhere the social workers. It doesn't make any difference." The baby cried and Margaret began to rock her, trying to soothe her. When she looked up, her sister was gone. Only the wind blew from the ajar door. 25 years later, a large wall clock struck 6 in the morning. The hand indicated the early hour, when everyone who didn't have to get up early for work was asleep. But Margaret was already at the stove, cooking oatmeal and scrambled eggs. Kieran didn't eat porridge, he liked eggs with bacon. His loving mother was trying to please his tastes. Kieran and Matthew had to be up early for work at 8 in the morning, and Margaret had to leave half an hour earlier. So they had to get up at 6 to make breakfast, iron shirts, and walk the dog. The dog ran up to his mistress, wagging his tail merrily. Margaret wasn't really his owner. Kira had gotten him for herself, but then she'd married Andrew, who was allergic to fur. That's how, completely unnoticed, the poor animal ended up in a small 2-room apartment. After finishing her chores, Margaret began to get ready for work. She was an ordinary school teacher, teaching geography in a small school. Since childhood, she had dreamed of traveling. However, life happened, so that she had only seen other countries in pictures and textbooks. Traveling to work took Margaret a lot of time. She rode a bicycle because she did not have a car. The family had 2 cars, one for Matthew and one for Kieran. Margaret helped them buy these cars. Matthew was the first to get a used car for his 18th birthday. But soon his younger brother envied him. The woman had to take a loan to please her favorite son. Mom, of course, they did not drive to work, they were waiting for a hard day's work, which required rest and sleep. In good weather, Margaret would ride her bicycle to work, but in snow or rain she could take the bus. Margaret had a best friend, the energetic Stacy. They had met at school when Margaret came to apply for a job as a geography teacher after college. Stacy taught biology and often visited her friend to chat about life and discuss the latest news. This day was no exception. When Margaret arrived at the school, she learned that the 11th graders had been taken away to prepare for the last bell, so she had no class. Stacy, who had handed out test papers to the noisy 5th graders, had quietly retired to a nearby office to check the exam schedule. She caught Margaret checking her notebooks. "Girlfriend, do you ever get any rest?" she asked. Margaret lifted her big blue eyes and removed her glasses from her face. She looked at her friend with a mixture of squint and bewilderment. "I didn't have time to check on the house last night. I'd stayed up late cleaning the bathroom. Then I had to wash the stain on Matthew's white shirt. He likes it very much," Margaret said. "What time did you go to bed?" Stacy asked lazily, anticipating the answer. She had known Margaret for years and was aware of all her household chores. Margaret shrugged her shoulders, put her notebook aside, and stood up from the table. "Would you like some tea?" She nodded at the kettle. Stacy nodded. 2 o'clock, I think. I can't remember, to be honest. Kieran was up late watching some really interesting movie, and I couldn't sleep, Margaret admitted. Stacy rolled her eyes. "I still can't understand why you're sleeping in the same room as Kieran while Matthew is alone. Aren't kids supposed to be in the same room?" she muttered. "And they're hardly children. They're not thinking of moving out of their mother's house. They're both well into their third decade." Margaret shook her head and remained silent. She thought her friend's talk was nonsense. Stacy herself had married much later than Margaret and had had a daughter 15 years ago. It was certainly not her place to talk about such things. "How's Digit?" Stacy asked, putting sugar in her mug. Margaret shrugged. "She and Andrew had a fight the other day. I don't know how things are going over there. I try to stay out of their lives. You know she should be very grateful to you," Stacy said with a bit of pressure. "Why would I put that in my head? Margaret was the only one who got the hint. You're too good a mom for her." Margaret shrugged her shoulder uncertainly, slightly embarrassed. She understood what Stacy meant, and she hated that her friend had brought up such an unpleasant subject. "How's your Joshua? He sent me some pictures from the university the other day. I'll show you." Stacy smiled and reached for her cell phone, which was full of pictures of her nephew at the university in the capital. Margaret came home before her sons for the first time in a long time. Usually she stayed up late with her failing students or checked a mountain of notebooks. Today she excused an 8th grade boy in honor of his birthday and left the notebooks behind. Then the next day, her daughter called and asked to meet. Kira didn't see her mother often, and this was an event for Margaret. She hurried home to make her daughter's favorite pie. Kira arrived early. Margaret had not yet had time to take the pie out of the oven when the doorbell rang. The woman hurried to open it, trying not to trip over the kachapuri running around her former landlady. On the threshold stood her tall, red-haired daughter in a beautiful red dress. The girl smiled at her mother and threw herself around her neck, comfortably intercepting the box of chocolates. "Mommy, I'm so happy to see you," Kira said enthusiastically. "What smells so good?" Margaret smiled and called into the kitchen. "Guess if it's my favorite cherry pie?" "Mommy, you're great." The girl rushed into the kitchen, petting the dog on the way. Margaret hurried to take the pie out of the oven before it burned. Kira started making tea. "How are you two doing?" Margaret asked, cutting into the steaming, flavorful pie. Kira smiled broadly and shrugged her shoulders. "Andrew and I made up. He gave me 27 roses in honor of the number of months we've been together, and then he took me to a rooftop restaurant. You should have seen how beautiful it was." Margaret smiled, happy for her daughter, and put the cake on the table. She sat down on a stool. Kira set out several fragrant mugs of tea and sat down opposite, settling herself deftly. "I haven't called them in a while," Margaret shrugged, setting the pie down for herself and her daughter. "Kieran's studying, he's almost done his diploma. And Matthew? I think he's got a girlfriend. But he won't tell me anything, can you imagine? Though I don't bother." "That's right," Kira nodded. "He's a big boy now. We're only a year and a half apart. I think he already knows what he should do with a girl." Kira laughed. Margaret picked up her laughter and shook her head. "You know, Andrew and I have decided to take out a mortgage so we can have our own place," her daughter continued. "Soon we will have children, and it is difficult to raise them in a rented apartment." "Why are you making excuses?" Margaret exclaimed. "It's all right. I raised you in a foreign city, in an apartment that didn't belong to us. So having your own apartment is the right thing to do." "Are you saying that to share or to get my approval?" Kira asked, setting the mug aside. The smile came off her lips. She looked out the window, then at the leg of the kitchen table, and finally shifted her gaze to her mother. "It's not one thing or the other, you know. To get a mortgage, you need a down payment. Andrew and I don't have that kind of money right now." Margaret left her cup of tea too and looked at her daughter carefully. Do you want me to give you money? Kira shrugged his shoulders. I know you have some. You'll buy for a vacation abroad. There's not only money for vacations, but for a rainy day. Margaret said slowly. The joy of her daughter's arrival had already waned, and the woman spoke with a note of sadness, foreshadowing an unpleasant conversation. Do you want me to give you the last of my savings? Not exactly, Kira answered. How can I explain to you that we need that money? We need a place to live. As soon as Andrew gets his bonus, we'll pay you back a part of it, and then. The woman raised her hand in front of her, asking her daughter to shut up, and pressed her lips together. She didn't like to say no to her daughter, couldn't stand saying no to her children, but sometimes she had to. You haven't paid me back the money you borrowed for Andrew's car almost a year ago. You promised me that you'd give it all back to me with the bonus. And then it was vacation money too, the last one. Kira rolled her eyes. Mom, you're being dramatic. You're the one who will remember every penny of it. Margaret grinned bitterly and shook her head. I'm not reminiscing about every penny. I'm just asking you to be a little more attentive to your mother. You didn't even come to my birthday party. You forgot your brother's graduation and missed your grandmother's funeral. I was working, Kira exclaimed. So was I. But for some reason I always came to your birthday parties. And even when you and Andrew quarreled for the first time, and you sat and cried on the embankment in the rain, I took off work and came. Don't you remember that? Kira looked away and pressed her lips together, just like her mother had done a few minutes ago. So you won't give me the money then? Margaret shook her head. Kira jumped up from her seat, nearly dropping her chair, and rushed to the door. Thanks for your help, Mommy, the girl said, slamming the door. The woman lowered her head. Tears flowed from Margaret's eyes. She could no longer contain herself. Large salty drops fell on the white tablecloth. Her sobs could be heard throughout the apartment. Something clenched in the woman's chest, causing unbearable pain. In the evening, when Margaret had calmed down and was minding her own business, her sons returned. Mom, are you home? Nick called out. Margaret responded. From the kitchen, she was preparing dinner for her sons. I asked you to iron the white shirt yesterday, and you ironed the blue one. Like a fool, I came to the open house alone in blue, Nick complained. The woman rolled her eyes tiredly. She probably would have tolerated it another time. But after her conversation with Kira, she'd been on edge. The white one hung in the closet. It wasn't that hard to get it out and iron it. It would have taken a couple minutes. Was it hard for you to memorize my request? She asked capriciously. Nick entered the kitchen. Margaret turned sharply in his direction and threw the towel back on the refrigerator. You're almost 22 years old. You're a grown guy, running around dating girls and looking for a prestigious job. And you ask your mom to iron your damn shirt. Are you going to hide behind your mother's skirt for the rest of your life, just like your bad father? Said the woman loudly, throwing off her apron. And you sleep in your brother's room now. I'm a grown woman and I want to spend my free time in peace, not listening to your conversations and watching movies at 2 a.m. Earthquakes are caused by the shifting of tectonic plates. The most seismically active zones in our country are Kamchatka and Sakhalin Island. There is also the largest volcano there, Klushevskaya Sopka. It is very dangerous to live there. There is a risk of an earthquake or volcanic eruption. Japan is also in a seismically active zone. Shifts of tectonic plates also cause the formation of large mountain massifs. The higher the mountain, the earlier it formed. So one plate is thrust over another, Margaret said slowly and measuredly, scrolling through her pen and occasionally looking out the window. Margaret liked to teach lessons, but sometimes she purposely forgot her homework and taught new material, ignoring the bustle and chatter of the students. There was a reason for that now. Her mind was reeling over the past day, and she couldn't figure out who was right and who was wrong. Margaret thought she had been too harsh with the children. After all, it wasn't Vincent's fault that she had forgotten about the white shirt. Kira was just beginning her adult life, and she needed her parents' support. Besides, comparing her son to his father was wrong. Margaret was sure she'd managed to raise her sons differently from their father, who'd abandoned the family for another woman. Vincent did sleep in his brother's room. In the morning, Margaret didn't say anything to them and, resentful, went to work to check the notebooks left over from the previous day. It seemed so wrong. But an inner voice, still offended by her daughter's words, argued that Margaret had done the right thing. The woman's musings were interrupted by the creak of the door, which slowly opened, and a short, blonde-haired boy entered the study. He tossed his backpack beside his desk and sat down, grinning and glaring at the teacher. Margaret, surprised at this insolence of a student, stood up from her desk to tower over the 8th grader. Someone started laughing. All thoughts of home and problems with the children immediately popped into Margaret's mind. She looked at the boy, at his grin and his cocky face, and immediately remembered her children, Kira's face when she'd heard her mother wouldn't give her money, Vincent's face when he'd wondered about the shirt. And the woman snapped. "Swan, get up from the table quickly," Margaret said sternly, "or your parents will be called to the school, and you'll be out of here immediately." She glared angrily at the student. Every movement, every sound, every smirk, and every movement made her dislike him. "Really?" The boy grinned. "Do you know who my father is to talk like that?" "You spoiled Mama's boy, Swan." Margaret continued in a harsh tone. "Leave my office immediately," the boy said irritably. "What are you going to do? Drool on a child? You're a loser like all the teachers in this school, working for a pittance, dissatisfied with your life, hating children. I can tell you haven't had a man in a long time, Margaret." Margaret opened her mouth and gasped with indignation. Her hands clenched into fists. She looked at the boy and saw only evil incarnate. The woman grabbed the schoolboy's backpack with one hand, his ear with the other, and hurried toward the door. She almost threw the boy into the hallway, then threw his briefcase after him, which hit the concrete floor and the contents spilled out. "Get out, you little rascal," shouted the woman. "Shove your insolence where you belong, and don't you dare come to this office again. You nasty, brainless boy." Margaret slammed the door angrily. To her surprise, there were shocked teachers standing in the hallway. The woman shifted her gaze to the children and saw the frightened looks on their faces. They looked at her with fear, clutching at their desks. Margaret sighed and returned to her seat. The students ducked into their books. After all that had happened, Margaret pondered the boy's words. He had a point. The teachers at the school worked for low wages, tolerated the insolent remarks of the students, and were unhappy with their lives. Every day she watched herself, Stacy, and the other co-workers. They were all terribly tired, with lots of problems at home and at school. Someone who had succumbed to life's hardships, the kids were afraid. Some who chose tactics of indifference, the kids loved. The second option belonged to those teachers who happily went home, letting the children go home a few lessons early, not conducting tests and talking to them on extraneous topics. Oh yes, those kids loved them. True. Then in colleges and universities they cried about not knowing English or physics. The reason was the teachers who chose their peace. But those who tried to give children knowledge were not loved. And Margaret was one of those who tried to combine the two tactics. Margaret meekly tolerated the attacks of students like that blonde-haired, bald-headed boy Swan. She went along when kids asked to be let off early on Fridays, or the last day of the quarter, while still trying to teach lessons and provide knowledge. The woman never thought the day would come when her kindness would only lead to trouble. There were few students like Swan, but the few that did take advantage of her teacher's kindness grew more and more insolent as time went on. The school disliked teachers most of all because of such children, and they turned into strict, uncompromising people who wanted only to leave their hated jobs as soon as possible. Swan, however, was a special case. His father, a local politician, had a lot of power and initially gave his son to a prestigious school, where everything was presented to such children on a platter. However, after another scandal involving the son of the mayor of a neighboring town, in order to save his place, the politician had to transfer the boy to a regular school. Of course, at first Swan was difficult to adapt, but he soon realized that you can trump the influence of his father and actively used it. Teachers let him get away with everything, children avoided him, and everything was relatively calm. Until Margaret took umbrage, she was in a bad mood because of personal problems. On a normal day, I would probably have gently reprimanded the boy for being late so as not to create conflict, she thought. but this time I couldn't help myself. After class, as Margaret was about to go home, she was called to her office by the principal on the school radio. Those teachers who were still in the school saw the woman off with pity as she walked down the corridor. One even patted her on the shoulder. Joshua knocked on the open door and Margaret stepped inside. The principal was a short, gray-haired old man with a bald spot on his head, sitting in a high office chair, rubbing his forehead with a wrinkled hand. He looked up at the teacher who entered and put on his half-rimmed glasses, looking at her carefully. Margaret, "Hello," Joshua said hello and pointed to a chair in front of the desk. Margaret nodded and sat down. "Is this about Swan?" Joshua nodded. "I'm sorry, Margaret. I remember you as a girl when you came in after college with a baby in your arms. I remember everything you did for the school. But you realize we don't need conflict with a powerful man. How did you even get that boy out of your office by force? That's not like you." Margaret lowered her head low and sighed. "I'm sorry, Joshua. It's just that I'm having problems at home and a bad day." And he's been saying things like that. Margaret sighed, trying to hold back tears. Joshua held out a glass of water and shook his head. He folded his wrinkled hands on the table, squeezing them into a lock with force. "I'd love to keep this thing quiet, but you have to realize the school doesn't want trouble with his powerful father. We'll lose funding and be plagued with inspections. All the teachers will be sent in for background checks. It's easier for me to leave the school," Margaret concluded quietly, taking a drink of water. Resentment and despair squeezed her throat, cutting off her oxygen supply. The woman was almost out of breath. The school was part of her life. She'd worked there for over 20 years. The office, the children, the lessons, the notebooks, it all seemed so familiar. It couldn't be otherwise. And now that part was being taken away from her, leaving her soul torn to shreds. "I'll let you leave on your own. I'll try to keep the conflict quiet so the details don't get out beyond the walls of the school. But you realize it's hard to hide something like this. Everyone will talk, and the kids will bring other stories to their parents. If you ever want to work in a school, it won't be in our town." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, and memories of days gone by flashed before her. She could clearly see the day she had to leave her hometown so that she and Kira could have a normal life. History was repeating itself. The town where she had raised 3 children, found friends, a job, and co-workers had to be left. It was as if fate mocked her every time life seemed to fall into place. With a black pen left over from her exams, Margaret wrote a letter of resignation. Her sprawling teacher's signature flaunted on the white sheet, letting the woman know that this was the end. The end of normal life, the end of everything she had. "Can I take my things back?" the woman asked quietly. Joshua nodded. "Sure, Margaret, you can come say goodbye to the kids, to your co-workers. Maybe when this boy graduates, you'll be able to go back again." "Thank you, Joshua," Margaret nodded. "I'm grateful for the kindness, for all you've done for me." When Margaret came to work at the school, Joshua was the vice principal and physics teacher. He treated with kindness the young girl, who was not even 20 when she came to work before she had finished her studies. He helped her get on the waiting list for housing for a young family. He let her go when Kira was sick, stayed with her during maternity leave, and helped the young girl in many ways. Margaret was grateful to him for that. With a stone in her heart, Margaret went into the study to retrieve her things and a few books. She was followed in by Stacy, who, only seeing her friend's hard stare, shook her head. She immediately realized what had happened. "The principal gave me time to pack and say goodbye. He's wrong. It's not your fault what happened. We all wanted to do that to that underling, Stacy. I forced him out into the hallway, and he fell to the concrete floor. Thank God he didn't hurt himself. Not only would I have been sued, but I wouldn't have been able to forgive myself." Margaret exhaled and sat back in her seat, covering her face with her hands. I understand that this is a difficult situation for Margaret. The fact that she was given the opportunity to resign is not a bad thing, because many people would have been fired with a reprimand on their record for such an incident. Stacy walked over to her friend and lightly hugged her from behind. She rested her head on her shoulder for moral support. "The house is a mess," Margaret said. "I had a fight with Jessica. She asked for money for the mortgage. I said no. It's all because of that. You see, if I'd given the money, everything would have been all right. But no. Nothing would have been okay, Stacy replied sharply. They're adults, and they're sitting on your neck. You couldn't stand it, if not now, then later. And you need to start your life without them. They're your kids, I get it, but you don't have to give them all of yourself. You've done too much for them already, especially for her. Margaret shook her head, staring down at her desk. She saw notebooks, textbooks, pens, and a newspaper. The woman grabbed it and shoved it at the pages of advertisements. Look, Margaret jabbed her finger at a small ad on the last page. There's a cabin for sale cheap in the next county. This village borders the town where my grandmother lived. She died a long time ago, but I remember how beautiful it was there. So buy it. Stacy exclaimed. I know you have the money, and you could almost go back to your hometown. It's right next to your hometown. Margaret nodded. You can start a new life away from the children of powerful people who don't know how to raise them. Do you think it's worth it? The peace of mind, Margaret asked thoughtfully. Yes, replied Stacy with conviction. Stacy's husband, Jason, helped Margaret move things into her new home. The woman had packed everything up while the children were out of the house. She left them a short note and left, determined to start a new life. It seemed so strange at 40+ years old to start over. Stacy didn't understand her friend's worries, but she kept cheering her up. The house was not far from Margaret's hometown. A 40-minute bus ride would take her to the cemetery where her mother and father were buried. I realized that for Margaret it was a difficult but exciting start to a new chapter in her life. Although the cottage seemed a little dilapidated, it had potential. Jason said it could be repaired, the roof could be fixed, the kitchen floor could be redone. There was gas, the walls were solid, and there was even some furniture left. The man shifted his gaze to the broken chair Stacy sat in. Almost whole, he grinned. How's your money doing? Jason asked. Margaret shrugged. I spent most of it on the house, of course, and haven't added to my savings in a while. However, it will be enough for the first time. Maybe I can even pay for the roof repairs. Do you think that's expensive? Jason scratched the back of his head and looked at the roof. If you hire a crew, it's not cheap. But you can find local men in the village and they'll do it cheaper. The main thing is not to hire drunks, they will sing more than work. Margaret grinned. I'll know. Okay, thank you guys. You've been a big help. Stacy waved goodbye to her friend and got in her car. She had to get to the rehearsal for the 9th grade prom. Margaret stepped out of the house and looked around more closely. It was small, 4 rooms, a bedroom, a kitchen, a bathroom, and a hall. There was also a small porch, but it was a summer porch. Consider it for a separate room, she thought. It seemed to the woman that she was very lucky to buy a house for such a small amount of money. When she asked the seller why it was so cheap, he said that the village was dying out. The school might be closed soon. No one wants to buy houses there. Besides, he had gotten the house by chance from a deceased great-aunt, so he didn't value it much. There was a lot of work to be done to improve the house, but Margaret was ready for it. She was alone at last. Margaret spent more than 3 days cleaning the old house. On the 4th, she left the most difficult part of the job, the attic. She was afraid to go up there. It didn't look safe, and it was much dirtier than the other rooms. It looked like no one had been up there in 20 years, if not more. The woman set her bag down beside her and slowly climbed through the trapdoor in the ceiling. Margaret almost fell in, but when she found herself at the top, she realized there was more work than she thought. The attic was full of boxes and old trunks where women had stored their belongings long ago. Margaret decided to start sorting through the boxes to throw away anything that wasn't needed. Rolling up her sleeves, she sighed and sat down on the dusty floor. The first 3 boxes were of women's things. The 4th contained children's toys. Margaret took them apart at first, winding up dolls and wiping down dusty cars. But then she gave up the useless endeavor and left the box. Another box had albums of photographs. Margaret leafed through them, marveling at the happiness of the people in the pictures, and set them aside. The farthest box was small and light. Margaret opened it and aghast. On the very top was a wooden frame containing a picture of her sister Vivi and a strange guy. They were hugging and looking happily into the camera lens. Vivi, Margaret whispered with shaky hands, snatching the photo away. The girl looked exactly as she remembered her long, thick black hair, dark eyes, sharp facial features, and a narrow nose. Margaret hadn't seen her sister in over 25 years. She was sure she was dead. Seeing a picture of Vivi happy seemed very strange and brought bitterness to her soul. Margaret pulled out the frame and saw a small wooden box with 2 letters VI carved into it. The woman unlocked it and saw a small pendant in the shape of a scarab beetle and a Vera pendant. Underneath it lay another photograph. This picture only showed a guy in uniform. On the back was written the year. Margaret gasped in surprise the year of her daughter's birth. The man was smiling. A letter lay next to it. Margaret unfolded it and, smiling, began to read the lines. Dear Vivi, I am writing to you, hoping for a reply. You have not answered for so long that I was afraid something had happened to you. Grandma should be coming to visit soon. I hope you'll be with her. I missed you madly. Your hair the color of night and your piercing eyes that looked straight into my soul. I can't live without the touch of your velvet skin. A day without you is agony, and I haven't seen you in 5 months. I miss our moonlit lounges and long late-night conversations. I hope all is well with you. Your lover. Margaret sighed sadly. This seemed to be the child's father. There were others under that envelope. With each letter, Alex grew more and more worried. He wrote that he missed her and couldn't be without Vivi. In the last letter he wrote, Grandma was in the other day and told me that you went to your house and never came back. I have no idea what happened. Probably you found someone else richer or prettier. I don't know. I hope you're happy. In case you're wondering, I've decided to stay in the army on a contract. You probably won't read this. I don't know your new address, so I'm writing to my grandmother's address. Alex. Alex seemed to really love Vivi. However, she wasn't there for her. She needed something else, not just love. She was looking for something different. Margaret went downstairs. She didn't want to read the letters anymore. It bored her. She felt sorry for Alex. He wrote such beautiful lines. About Vivi. Vivi was her own person. All the years as the older sister, she had acted like she was a couple years younger than Margaret. The then still young girl had to deal with her problems and hide their consequences from her ailing father. If something happened to Vivi, everyone ran to Margaret, and she dealt with all the problems. A broken window, missing money from her father's stash, late returns, and more. Vivi never thought about the feelings of others. Alex was no exception. Margaret cooked potatoes and cucumbers she'd bought from her neighboring grandmother on the old, salted stove and sat down to dinner. The food, however, did not go down her throat. She looked at the seemingly appetizing potatoes and cucumbers, but could not swallow a bite. Everything seemed terribly bland and unpalatable. The reason for this was thoughts of her sister. Margaret hadn't seen her sister in over 25 years. She didn't even know if Vivi was still alive. Now her conscience began to plague her for that. Vivi was her sister, whatever she was, and so she couldn't just abandon her. We have to find her, Margaret said firmly, and took a bite of cucumber. A clear plan formed in Margaret's mind. She saw no obstacle to finding her sister. The letters had stirred her soul. The next morning, Margaret went upstairs to go through the boxes looking for something that might help find Vivi. There was nothing useful in the letters. At the very bottom of one of the boxes, however, was an old notebook with lots of numbers and addresses in it. The numbers were probably invalid. It had been so long, but the addresses could be verified. Margaret could safely say that the book belonged to her sister. She could recognize Vivi's crooked handwriting from 1,000 sprawling letters and the long, intricate curls. At the very end of the book was a name, Diakova Janie. Next to the name was written, Call. Help Vivi had a habit of signing everything she could so she wouldn't forget. She always carried a notebook with her and wrote in it the names of suitors, the places and times she met them, so she wouldn't get them mixed up. Margaret had laughed at this habit before, but now she realized there was nothing wrong with it. She tore out the sheet with Janie's name on it and stuffed it in her pocket. Sure, it had been a while, but maybe this Janie could help find Vivi. The woman finished all the chores around the house. She asked her neighbors for the best bus ride to the address in the book and planned the trip. She left early the next day. Margaret was glad to be back in her hometown, to walk through familiar places from her childhood, and to remember the past. The woman walked past the school and smiled as she saw the windows of her class and remembered her graduation. She had been predicted a successful future then. Margaret knew what university she was going to attend and was seriously preparing for the exams. And then what happened happened. The house she needed to go to was on the very outskirts of the city. The poorest families lived in that neighborhood. In Margaret's class, only 2 classmates were from that neighborhood. They walked around in shabby clothes and often bruised. Both dropped out of school after 9th grade and moved into the dormitory. Margaret hoped that their lives were better than during their high school years. The basement where Janie's apartment was supposed to be was doorless. Margaret walked slowly inside, looking around cautiously. "We'll put it up soon," said the man smoking on the bench hoarsely. He smelled foul, probably of alcohol and cheap cigarettes. Margaret smiled, nodded, and quickly went inside before the man said anything more. The entryway had the same odor as a smoker, with a dash of urine scents. The woman sighed and headed for the 3rd floor. The apartment she was looking for had to be there. There was no elevator, of course. Apartment 11 was on the 3rd floor. It had a massive metal door with obscene writing on it. The bell was recessed into the wall. Margaret pressed the button and carefully removed her hand. It was unknown if it worked or not. A moment later, she heard heavy footsteps and grumbling outside the door. "Who's in there?" The door swung open. A tall, full woman with disheveled hair, wearing a laundered bathrobe with a grease stain on her chest, stood on the threshold. "Hello. Are you Janie Dykova?" Margaret smiled. "Why?" The woman looked her over from head to toe. "You see, I'm looking for my sister. Her name is Vivi. She wrote your address in her address book." The woman made an inarticulate, throaty sound and laughed. "I haven't heard from her in years. I owed her something, so I helped her about 30 years ago. Maybe less." "When was the last time you saw her?" Margaret asked. Janie shrugged. "I'm telling you, it was about 30 years ago. No, wait, about 25. The neighbor's little boy was still born then. His mom was here yelling when she went into labor that day. And we just celebrated his 25th birthday." "What did she want? Where'd she go?" Janie grumbled. "She came running, and everyone took off, asked for help finding a place to live. But I gave her the number of someone I knew who had a room for rent in a communal apartment in the neighborhood. She took it and ran." "Could you give me the address?" Margaret asked. Janie grinned and held out her hand. "We don't give out information for free." Margaret rolled her eyes but reached into her purse. She pulled out a 3-0 bill, handed it to the woman, and tilted her head. Janie went back into the house, tore a small slip from the wall calendar, and wrote the address on it in scrawled handwriting. "Here you are, Snow White. You're the only one who has nothing to catch there." The woman shrugged her shoulders. "Why not? I heard she got married, so I don't think she's ever been in this dump. It's been so many years yet." Margaret had been told that phrase too often lately. She braced herself, snatched the paper with the address out of the woman's hand, and walked away. "Thank you," Margaret mumbled politely. She wanted to wash up after being in that entryway, so she went home. She'd have time to go to the address. The next day, Margaret went to the school to ask about the vacancy. She had no intention of going home. Of course, the kids called her, but she didn't answer. That's what Stacy had said. Her opinion was one the woman usually listened to. Of course, it was heavy on her heart that she hadn't answered her sons. However, for the first time in a long time, the woman felt free. The school was small, 2-story, with windows open everywhere. May was hot, and there were children with countenances running in the street. Next to them was a short woman with white hair and wearing a long skirt. She was giving instructions and periodically approached the girls who were planting flowers. "Petrova, haven't you ever planted flowers? What is this? You should have covered it all the way with earth," the teacher said. Margaret chuckled softly and walked over to the woman. "Excuse me, could you tell me where the principal's office is?" she asked. "Good afternoon," the teacher smiled. "Are you someone's mom?" "Oh no, I wanted to get a job," Margaret replied. "My children are grown up now. I just moved to your village and I need a job. I thought you might have something here," Margaret told the teacher. "Are you a geographer by training?" "Oh, we have a vacancy for a geographer. But you could go and see Kieran Vincent and see what you can find. First floor, third office. Go in and walk straight ahead. His door's on the left. Don't miss it." Margaret nodded gratefully and went into the school. The principal's door was indeed where the woman had said. Margaret knocked. "Come in," came a muffled voice. "Hello, my name is Margaret Swan. I'm a geography teacher. I've just moved here and I need a job." Esmeralda nodded and smiled broadly. "My name is Esmeralda. I'm the headmistress. Sit down. Tea, coffee?" Margaret shook her head and sat down. "The geographer's place is unfortunately taken. But we have a vacant place for a teacher of technology and labor. And you will hardly agree to teach Russian," Esmeralda clarified. Of course, Margaret nodded. "Isn't there a technology class there? Isn't it?" "Tana taught that. She's a biologist, but she can't work two jobs. You know, she teaches everyone biology, and she's the class teacher. She's also the head teacher. You know, it's a lot of work." "Then I could take the place of the technology teacher," Margaret smiled. "Would you?" Esmeralda shook her head. "There's no point in signing you up now. Let's start with the new school year. But you probably need a job right now, don't you?" "That would be nice," Margaret grinned, remembering how much money she had left in her account. "We're short a teacher at the day camp in July. Would you agree?" Margaret nodded. Esmeralda took out a blank sheet of paper and wrote something on it. "You will collect the list of documents, pass the commission, and you can come. I'm processing you. You're just in time. Wouldn't you know it, Margaret? They're going to close our school. You see, not enough students, not enough students, not enough teachers. But no. New people are coming to the village." Margaret smiled. "Yes, it's very beautiful here. If it's no secret, where did you move to?" "The 15th house on Oktyabrskaya Street," Margaret answered. "Tana's house. We remember her. She didn't have children of her own, but she always had a lot of kids coming to see her. Her nephews used to come. She'd invite the village kids, give them all a treat. She was a kind woman. May she rest in peace." "Don't you remember?" Esmeralda asked. "She didn't have a girl who lived here. About 25 years ago, tall, bald, with big eyes. And a girl like that. I remember Alex's fiancé, Tana's nephew. She was a strange girl. I never liked her. I was a little older myself. She was like, I don't know." "What's your point? Did you find the pictures in the attic?" Margaret shrugged and got up from her chair. "Thank you for your help, Esmeralda. I'm going to go get the paperwork together." Margaret cheerfully walked out of the school and headed home. She had a home, she almost had a job, and maybe soon she would find her sister. Suddenly something niggled inside, as if warning her. But the woman paid no attention. She only smiled at the sight of children running around the schoolyard. The house at the address Janie had given her was the same as her own, except there was a door in the entryway. On the bench sat a man exactly like the one at Janie's house. He was smoking a cigarette and glaring mockingly at Margaret. The woman seemed to be headed inside the apartment, which was on the 5th floor. Margaret climbed the stairs, the soles of her new sneakers sticking to them, and saw a door with 4 bells next to it. The woman was confused and rang the first one. A few seconds later, someone opened the door. "I'm not buying anything," said the old woman, whose voice I'm not selling. Grinning. The woman waved her hand in the direction of the house and went to cook dinner herself. Alex really stayed at Margaret's place. He ordered material for the fence and even fixed the roof. All morning he had been climbing on it, tapping and drilling. After lunch, he climbed down, clapped his hands together and said, "Take the job, mistress. It won't last forever, of course, but it'll do for a couple months." "Thank you. Let's go inside. I bought some kvass from my neighbor. Would you like some homemade?" Sure, the man smiled broadly. stretching his crescent-shaped scar. Every day Alex did something new in the house. Then he ate Margaret's lunches and praised them. It was a mandatory routine. The woman noticed that the uninvited neighbor was very good-looking. He's tall, trim, strong. He was also hardworking. Alex was nothing like Margaret's ex-husband. All he did was lie on the couch after a hard day's work. Every weekend, he went to a bar with his friends. Even the day Matthew had a fever of 40 degrees was no exception. Margaret called an ambulance, and during the examination, her husband came back to the house, barely standing on his feet. He yelled at the doctor, and then went to sleep in the middle of the living room. Margaret was terribly ashamed at the time, and the doctor advised her to leave such a husband. Margaret's new neighbor was quite different, sensitive and intelligent. He kept up conversations about books and various places. "I've been to Prague," he said. A co-worker had gone there, and I was visiting him. Margaret only smiled dreamily at the stories of various places. "I've always wanted to travel. But first there was Stacy, then Matthew, and then Vince. Besides, a teacher's salary doesn't really allow for traveling." "Why a teacher?" Alex asked and leaned back in his chair. He and Margaret were sitting across from each other in the living room. After a hard day, they were planting potatoes. Of course, it was late the end of May. But the neighbor gave a few buckets and said that if Margaret was going to stay living in the settlement, it was better to plant a vegetable garden. Alex, as usual, didn't stay away. "I wasn't going to go to pedagogy," Margaret admitted. But then Yuji showed up. "I blew the entrance exams, moved to another city to avoid the ridicule of the neighbors. And I went to the pedagogy school there as a part-time student. I barely graduated and went to work. That's the secret. I love being around kids, but it's hard. I got kicked out for throwing a student out into the hallway by force." There was a whistling sound in the room. Alex shook his head in surprise. "Are you serious? That was wrong. I will try to do the editing of the text, keeping it close to the original and following your instructions." Margaret shook her head. "Besides, he was the son of a judge. I also screwed over the school I worked at. Either you have a demon inside you, or that boy was that bad at geography." The woman thought back sadly to that day. "Geography had nothing to do with it," she said. "He was just cocky and overconfident, and I was too upset and angry. But, everything that's done is done for the best. Isn't it? I found my sister. And you ended up without a daughter. Yeah, it's definitely for the best." There was silence, which was broken only by the sound of an insect flying around the room. Alex couldn't find anything to say, so he just kept silent. Alex and Margaret grew closer. They sat and talked more and more often. In the evenings, he talked about the war and the army, she about children and school. Sometimes they went to help an old lady neighbor who rarely had children over. First they cleaned her house, then they helped in the vegetable garden. Alex also fixed her fence. The old lady was very grateful and gave the helpers a can of milk and a bag of pies. One day at the end of June, Alex, realizing that Margaret would be returning in the dark, went after her. He met her in the middle of the road. "Why are you here?" "It's dark," he said. "I thought you were scared." "Today is the 21st," Margaret said, as if it meant something. "It's the day of the shortest night of the year. It'll be light before you get home, won't it? But I'm scared to be home alone." Margaret laughed. She knew she liked Alex, and she knew he liked her, but she didn't know what the outcome of their affection would be. The blue night sky was covered in a scattering of 1,000,000 stars, and at the very top was a bright, full, warm moon, lighting the path so brightly it felt like it was daytime outside. "When you showed up at my compound and started talking about your sister, I thought you were just like her," Alex started to say suddenly. "A hypocritical bitch and cruel. But then I saw how upset you were about losing your daughter, and I realized that you weren't. You're the woman I always wanted to have by my side," Alex admitted. Margaret stopped breathing for a second, then took a deep breath, hesitating to look at Alex. "I haven't had a wife or even a relationship longer than a couple months. After Vivi, she took away any faith I had in women and people. But you've been able to restore my faith. Your jokes, your concern for the kids, your love for your work. It all made me see that there is good in this world." Why do you say that? Margaret asked. You and I are adults. I think it only takes a couple of days at our realized age to know if someone is your person or not. Margaret finally shifted her gaze to the man. He was looking straight at her. His eyes shone with hope and some feeling she didn't recognize. You are a very good man. Really 100 times better than my ex-husband or any man I've ever had in my life. But I'm in my 40s. I have 3 kids, a lot of problems, and a mean sister. Do you really need that? The man grinned and pulled Margaret to him. I'm not 15 either, Margaret, and I know what I need. A tiny flame of hope flickered in the woman's heart. She smiled timidly. Margaret was walking home from camp late at night. Everything had to be prepared before the inspection. It was almost dark outside, and she was enjoying the cool night air and moonlight. Then she saw someone walking towards her. Alex. Margaret smiled. A man was walking towards her with a small bouquet of flowers in his hands. Margaret smiled, embarrassed. Are these for me? It's for the most beautiful woman in this village. Alex tilted his head and said. Margaret laughed. Yes, clever. Very clever. Thank you. Alex smiled back and put up his elbow. Margaret put her hand on it. Shall we go for a walk? Only if it's to the house. I don't have the energy at all. Here's how I can edit the continuation of the text. Can you believe we've cleaned everything we can? Margaret said. I don't think a cleaning lady cleans that much in a year. We also put on everything we can in the compound before the inspection. One time they made us clean with a jump rope. Can you believe that? Margaret laughed. And we took a test before camp that had a question about how to sanitize baby nipples. And camps from the age of 7? How stupid is that? Alex shrugged. The phone rang. Margaret pulled the phone out of her pocket and gasped. It's Kira, the woman whispered, and took a step backward out of weakness. Alex picked her up, afraid she would fall. With a trembling hand, Margaret pressed answer. Hello, Kira. Yes, me. Who are you? Where's my daughter? What? How long? Let me talk to her. Please, Kira. Margaret put the phone down and looked at Alex in confusion. Her eyes were filled with fear, pain, and confusion. She's been kidnapped, Margaret said quietly. They told me to pay $1.5 million in cash. They said they'd send me an address. We have to go to the police. Gathering, Alex said. Margaret shook her head, and the sobs came out again. They said that if I go to the police, they wouldn't spare her. Alex sighed, taking the woman under his arms and leading her home. After packing their things, they went to the city. By morning, they were already at Margaret's house. She opened the door with her key. She was greeted by Vincent and Matthew. The boys were hugging their mother and looked worried. Mom, we can't reach Linky. It's been 2 days for Andrew, too, they said. What are you all so excited about? Shouted a cheerful voice from the kitchen. A woman in a red leather jacket came out into the corridor. The girl wanted to go for a walk. And you're already shouting. She won't have to live her life with that face. Margaret stared at her sister and threw herself at her. She caught hold of her dark hair and pulled. It was you, it was all you. You're the reason she stopped talking to me. You're the reason she was taken away. It's all you. Margaret screamed. The sons and Alex barely pulled Margaret away from Vera. Alex wrapped his arms around the woman, pressed her against him, and began to whisper soothing words in her ear. Margaret began to calm down. You're crazy, Vera shrieked, standing up. Vincent and Matthew looked at each other. Mom, are you saying she's been kidnapped? They asked. She already said that, Alex said a little harshly. We got a call for ransom. What makes you think it's my fault? Vera asked. Because there's no one else, Alex said again. You're the only one here who has gotten involved with dangerous people. Vera tilted her head and looked into the man's face. Alex, what are you doing here? Alex clenched his jaw, remaining silent. Guys, get her out of here. Otherwise, I can't vouch for myself, he said. Matthew nodded at the door. Faith opened her eyes wide. The boy took her gently under his arm and led her to the door. "Go to your brother's, Vera. You'll be better off there. No one needs you here. We only put up with you because of Linda." Vera adjusted her bag on her shoulder, hummed, her chin high, and walked quickly away. She was out of sight. A few minutes later, Vincent, Matthew, Alex, and Margaret were sitting at the table in the kitchen. Vincent was making tea while the others talked quietly. There was a cell phone in the middle of the table. Suddenly it rang. Margaret grabbed it and pressed the answer button. "Yes, the money. We don't have the whole amount. Give us time," she said. "Okay, we'll find it all. Is Linda alive? Let me talk to her." "Daughter, are you all right?" Margaret fell silent. Dropped, Vincent concluded, and put the tea on the table. "Mother, calm down. Did you hear Linda's voice?" Matthew asked. Margaret nodded. She was so frightened. "I can't. Where can we get so much money? Can we sell the cars?" Matthew shrugged his shoulders. "No," Alex said sharply. "I've already called my friends from the army. We'll do everything." The woman jumped up from her seat and grabbed Alex's hands. "No, you're not a robber. She's my daughter, but she's your daughter too," the man objected. "You raised her for years, didn't you?" "Don't you dare," Margaret shouted. "We'll find the money, we'll pay the ransom. Sell the cars," she ordered her sons. The boys nodded. "Is the whole sum here?" Margaret asked, wrapping her trembling hands around the bundle. She was breathing hard and looking around. Matthew nodded. "Mother, make it look easy, please. I'm carrying money to ransom my daughter. Do you really think I can be calm? I can't be calm on principle." The guy shook his head. "Good luck to you." Margaret nodded and walked forward. She had to save her daughter, even if she had to give up all the money to do so. Kira's life was the most important thing. The criminals called and told her to bring the money to the safe deposit box at the airport. Where to pick up Kira, they would tell her later. Margaret walked uncertainly through the airport trying to find the safe deposit boxes. She walked to the right one and slowly opened it, putting the money inside. She slammed the metal door shut and headed away without looking around. The phone vibrated and Margaret jumped in surprise. It was a text message with an address a few blocks from the airport. The woman rushed to the car where her son was waiting for her in Alex's car. "Matthew, let's go. I'll show you the way," she said. The boys started the car and they started. In just a few minutes they were there at the old abandoned factory. Margaret jumped out of the car and rushed inside. Matthew hurried after her. They searched every floor and even the basement, but the girl was nowhere to be found. Margaret screamed until she was hoarse, but there was no answer. The woman turned to her son and began to slowly slide down the cold wall. "Kira is gone. We've lost her, Matthew. We've lost our little girl." "Matthew, what am I going to do?" she moaned. The boy looked around confused. He shouted again and then picked up the mother and walked her to the car. While they were looking for the girl, the sun had set and it had gotten completely dark. Matthew dialed Alex's number. "Uncle Alex, it's empty," he said. "What about you?" Alex asked. "That we're on our way." They found her. Matthew smiled. About 20 minutes later, the car with Matthew and Margaret pulled up to a cottage village. There were several police cars parked near one of the houses. The blinkers were on and there were uniformed men everywhere. Vincent, surrounded by several large men, stood beside one policeman and said something. In the ambulance, wrapped in a blanket, sat Kira. Margaret saw her and rushed over to her. She tripped and fell on the cold grass. Matthew helped his mother up and they ran to the girl. "Kira." Margaret grabbed her daughter's face. "Are you all right? My good girl. Who was that?" Kira saw her mother and started to cry, wrapping her arms around her. "Mommy, they were alone in the apartment and they grabbed me. Who let them in?" Margaret screamed hysterically. She's Vivi. She let them in. She owes them a lot of money." I became the bait to get you to pay and repay her debts. Margaret ahed and staggered back, grabbing her son's arm. Are you sure of that? She told me herself. Kira nodded. Matthew, hearing his sister's words, rushed to call Alex. She's gone, neither at home nor at Kira's. I will personally find her and tear her to shreds, he gritted his teeth. Kira nodded and hugged her mother. Vincent walked over to Margaret and took her aside. She needed rest. You know about Vivi? The woman nodded. Her accomplices told me. She sold them her daughter. I can't believe it. How cruel and insane do you have to be? She's always been like that, Margaret exhaled. Do you know how she found Kira? She snuck into your house to find your residential address and followed it. Kira was just at the guy's place. Margaret shook her head in surprise. You were right. She's a terrible woman. A year later, a high fence stood outside a small house with a new red roof. A variety of flowers grew in the garden. A woman in a green dress jumped out of the house. I have to go, Vincent. It's your first day as a geography teacher, Stacy smiled. You have 40 minutes before school starts. Vincent caught up with the woman and pulled her close. You're too early, and I still have half an hour before work. Stacy laughed and waved her husband away. Look, I have to go, but I'll be home early. We have to go to Emily's tonight. We're going to be grandparents soon, aren't we? Vincent frowned. You're not a grandmother, you're the most beautiful girl. I haven't been a girl for too long, and you're going to have to accept that. Stacy laughed. You're going to be the youngest and most beautiful grandmother in the world. The phone rang. Mom, Lindsay had a baby. Alex yelled into the phone. I'm an uncle now, and Emily is an aunt. We're all uncles and aunts now. Matthew's joyful voice rang out. Girl 3200 added Angela, Matthew's girlfriend. Stacy disconnected the phone and smiled happily. Vincent picked her up and spun her around the yard. Maybe we should be parents again, he asked. Stacy laughed. We should be grandparents for now, and then we'll see from there. Anyway, we're going to Prague in August and then Venice. You remember, don't you? It's my dream, and now nothing will stop me from fulfilling it. It really was. Nothing and no one could stop Stacy from fulfilling her dream. The children learned to live on their own, accepting that a mother should have her own life. Vincent finally moved in with Stacy, beginning to set up house. Vivi was caught by the police in a neighboring town. Stacy went to see her only once. Vivi had begged her to take a statement, but her sister, who had gotten her out of trouble all her life, had said no for the first time. Only now did Stacy realize that in saving her sister from punishment as a child and young adult, she had only made things worse. Vivi was used to being selfish, expecting to always be helped. Now she's going to prison for selling her niece Kira, who will never remember her birth mother again. For she has realized that her real mother is Stacy.